No chance of it reaching. It lasts quite long.
I think that's although it yeah, I do it now.
So should we kind of turn it on and off between people?
It's probably easiest
Just to leave it and just let it go the day and
it's actually going actually yeah, there's a big one so that's
can I start it up again after lunch? We've got all day.
Oh, I see, it's the whole day.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yes, you can every morning.
Well, that's pretty good on its battery, but
but when it's doing video
all of
capture,
that.
it's actually used.
Well, I'll charge it up at the break.
Yes.
So just go and plug it in.
Yes.
Just leave it recording.
Yeah.
Plug it in there.
Yeah. It would be best to start with give it some type of
I'll just plug it in. It's not the most.
Yeah. That is now there as backup. It would be good to just get to that. I'll go ask you.
Yeah, and we should make sure that you have a chair for when you're not, when you've finished your talk, you don't want to have to walk.
Nothing about
It's lovely. Put it on the chair ready so you get that chair. Actually, Laurie's getting an event, I think, in July, so that I'll come to, so that'll be good. I'll, if she wants to give me that. Oh, sorry, Laurie is. She's the one who paid me. Yeah, that's what she wants.
So the thing to do. I think to do, I could just stop it at the lunch.
Right, yeah.
The lunch of.
Although you have to wait till the lunch.
Yeah. And what time would you kick off?
Not.
Can I replace? What are you using for? All right. Okay.
No.
Well, to break. That's fine.
If I come back up, and then so if you just hit the stop broadcast at the end of the day, then I'll be back and see where we are. I'll get out.
Personal rates replaced with and also it's yeah, and also because I would like just to make sure
but how
But on the other hand, there's a very chunks historical so maybe we yeah. Different situations necessitate I like the idea. Yeah, I mean that's what I'm like. There's an electrical concept, but then there's also I can see. Yeah. Station. Bring the minutes. Yeah. Whether they press the button. Yeah. Interactive. You should. That's right. Press the on button. Then you stand back slightly. And then more interactive. All that this is very important. Sometimes they seem to require. Yeah.
Sometimes there's just a technical one, isn't there?
Imagine with all this technology, maybe I think it doesn't matter.
These rituals have a microphone, actually. I could just go and ask if there's a radio.
Something that says volume here. Something here that says, something that says volume here.
That's if you're playing something. Yeah. No. Yeah. We could do a little test, and if it's not quite okay, we can make people come forward and listen carefully.
I can't move anywhere. So
no, we can't. Move it slightly that way, probably. I'll tell you what, I think we will maybe move the seats forward a bit.
This chair.
Just
So, good morning, everybody, and well done for making it through this delightful York weather. First of all, just a couple of things I'm supposed to say. There's housekeeping things I'm supposed to remember. So I've been told there is no test fire alarm due to go off. So if the fire alarm goes off, it really means there's going to be a fire. So you have to exit the building and stand in the rain car park or something. Toilets you may have noticed, but if not, you go out that way, feel like I'm on an aeroplane. Turn right. Find your oxygen mask. Yeah, so I think that's the only ones of those things to say now. You'll see there's various programs around, and we're going to try and keep to our program, even though this means I have to speak quite fast right now. I thought I would just say something just briefly about the background to setting this up, and also some of the things we want to just kind of thread through the day. So the idea of doing something on what we might call audiences, and one of the questions I think is this the term that brings things usefully together? Those of us who, like myself, work in the museum field often talk about visitors. And that has particular kind of implications. There's a kind of literature on idea of spectatorship and so on. And there have been critiques of the idea of the audience. And some of you probably know the, I always think, rather wonderfully titled book by Yen Ang called Desperately Seeking the Audience, where in that book what she does partly is kind of looks at how through the ways in which people go about even searching out or imagining what an audience might be, they're kind of constructing it too. And I thought that's probably an interesting thing to be thinking about. So when we use particular methods, and we kind of purposefully today really brought together people using very different approaches, but these raise other questions too, and especially in the discussion later, we really want to kind of push into some of those. So partly we'll look at methods, techniques, but we also want to look at some of those more methodological questions about what are the assumptions involved in using particular kinds of approaches, what kinds of audiences get made up, how varied can they be within our different frameworks? Do they end up just kind of end up reducing more to individuals? Are there other kinds of groupings? Do we want to look at them in terms of categories such as age, gender, class, ethnicity, and so on? So the ways we look let us get at different kinds of things and so on. And we might want at the end to think about, which methods might we really usefully put together, and can some get at some things more than others, and so on. Anyway, so those are some of the questions. There are a couple of immediate prompts some longer and some more immediate prompts to organising that event. So part of, I suppose, one of the things that was in my mind is kind of realising that sort of various of my own PhD students are kind of setting out on work where they need to do this kind of research. And I myself have done various bits of such work in the past, and I'm an anthropologist, and what I've done has included the kind of hanging out that's part of what we call ethnography, where you hang around and kind of see what's going on. So the work I've done has been in museums, also in kind of public spaces like kind of parks, but also putting that together with other kinds of things like the semi-structured interviews with groups, with individuals, accompanied visits, using visitor books. Actually, I trained as a tour guide for some of my work to do that work in some of those ways. So various kinds of techniques myself, but I was really aware there's so many others coming out, some really interesting things, and so I just thought it was a really good opportunity to kind of think about that. Then two things really came together to make this event happen. One is that the Department of Sociology had some money to spend, so we thought, well, let's have an event, so we should thank the Department of Sociology for some money and for the extra teaching that people did, I think, which has earned the money. The other thing was that Katiana, who's been in touch with some of you, Katiana Lemontec, who has come to York for 9 months as on a very nice postdoc doctoral fellowship, arrived, and she's going to be setting out to do some work on, I don't know if we'd say audiences, but they're visitors to a museum in China, and so was also very interested in this question, you know, what kinds of methods. It really sets big questions for those of us who are anthropologists, because some of the bases that our own ethnographic work is normally based on are quite hard in some cases to really replicate in these kind of contexts. So we're interested in looking at lots. So those of you who are speakers and things will know that Katiana has put absolutely masses of work into organising this event. So the other big thanks right at the beginning I want to say, I'm trying to remember at the end so well, but is to Katiana for really doing all that. That's been really, really tremendous. I think we should probably, at this point, go straight into the sessions, because trying to keep to time. So we've organised these 3 different themes, and this first one, we're going to be looking at the kind of connections, or especially around museums, art galleries, so these kind of audiences, in this case, but also a theme of space, but looking at it at very different kinds of levels. So first of all, with Professor Bill Hillier, who is head of the Space Syntax Lab, and really pioneered this whole field of space syntax. I have to say, I'm personally really excited to actually meet Bill at long last, because it's probably about 10 years ago that we started corresponding about some of this, because I was very interested in this. And actually, that's just another, I've never done proper, I always think I never did proper space syntax in my work, but I've done some of the kind of tracking work, and it definitely can produce really interesting things, but much more interesting in very much more capable hands. So Bill will take us right into some of these spaces. Then Laurie, who I'll introduce you later, will look at a kind of broader issues of space in a whole city, and so a really nice contrast there, I think. At this point, I should probably just really pass over to Bill. So as well as being director of the Space Syntax Lab, which is based at UCL, he's also chairman of the Bartlett Graduate School and professor of architectural and urban morphology, if I have that right, at London University. He's author of absolutely seminal books in this area, The Social Logic of Space and Space is the Machine, so you can follow up some of those later. So at that point, I think I should pass over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll take my coat off. It's
warming up.
Getting warmer than it was.
Probably because we're all a bit wet.
Can you hear me okay? I'm slightly worried that I've got a bit of a cold. Hope you don't hear me.
I'll get you some.
Okay, well, space syntax is a set of techniques for analysing spatial configurations at all scales, from domestic interiors, for example, to cities. In fact, we're now applying it to whole countries, which is rather interesting. It's also a set of theories linking space to society. I wouldn't describe it as a theory of space and society, but it does look for this and argues many fundamental linkages. And its aim is to bring to light the dimension of space in human affairs, how it sort of affects one thing or another. It has been applied to museums, how space plays a role in how museums and their exhibitions are structured and how this affects behavior, particularly questions like simple things like moving and viewing. So in this presentation, I will first present space syntax. Then I'm going to use the study of a particular museum to show how it can bring to light links between space and visitor behavior. And then I'll present some results from other studies which show other kinds of links. So I'll try to give you a sort of an overview of the kind of things that we can find out. So what is the problem that space syntax addresses? Well, here we see the building now known as Tate Britain, and we see it as a building form, and of course it's also a layout of space, as we see it on the right. And in both senses, they're ensembles. How bits are put together to form wholes is the fundamental thing. The configuration, if you like, of the building, the configuration of the space is fundamental. This gives us a problem because human beings tend to deal with configurational things as ideas they think with rather than ideas they think of. For example, with language we think of the words, but we think with the syntax of language. It's something that's unconscious in our minds. And things that give intelligibility. And space is like this. We think of individual spaces, but we don't have any conceptions or words or analyses to describe these complex patterns which are a normal part of our everyday life. So we have this rather peculiar position of being very competent at space and somehow, but we don't have to know how we're competent. We don't know how it is we can deal with spatial complexity and what spatial complexity means. Now language doesn't help very much because languages have terms for simple spatial relations like between or inside or beyond. These all describe relationships between three things if you think about them. But language offers us nothing at all, except possibly metaphors, to describe the kind of complex spatial patterns you can see in front of you now. And even much simpler things than this in a domestic dwelling, for example. There are still no concepts or terms which allow us to speak analytically about it. So we're competent in space, but how we are so eludes intuition. But because architecture is a functional science as well as an expressive art, it means architecture is always struggling to find ways of dealing with this, ways of either of analysing space, of understanding space in a systematic way, so you can begin to understand what its effects are. So where do we begin? Where do we begin with space? Well, the first thing is we must take great care not to follow the Western tradition, philosophical tradition, of seeing space as the background to objects. This has been our philosophical view of space since Descartes, I think, to prove the existence of space by conceptualizing it as the measurement of an object without the object there. Space is actually much more than this. Space is intrinsic to human activity. When we move, for example, we move linearly. There's a basic geometry to move and how we conceptualize where we want to go and how we get there. Interaction takes place in convex spaces, spaces where every point can see every other point. And as we move around in a complex environment, we see visual fields which have a sort of a strange shape with a kind of a central convex area and then spikes going in different directions. So these isovists, as they're called, are fundamental to our experience. So we have to begin, if you like, by recognizing that human beings build different kinds of spatial concepts into very basic activities. The second thing we need to know about space is its configuration. Configuration means relations which exist simultaneously, as in the case of this simple layout. All these relationships exist at one time, forming a configuration. So how do we sort of come to terms with this? How do we perhaps learn to analyze a configuration? The first thing we do is we convert the spatial layout into a graph. We represent each of the spaces as a circle. And then we connect the circles with lines representing the entrances between the spaces, if you like. And so we translate the layout into a diagram of relations. This is a graph, and once we have this, we can manipulate it in all kinds of ways and can calculate things about it. For example, you can take the little layout I showed you there, and we can take this space here, for example, and look at the shape of the configuration from that space. It connects to 4 spaces, as you can see all around it, then those connected to others. So this is a picture of the structure of the space from there. If we look at it from over here, we see a different picture. We see a much deeper picture. You can see that, if you like, this is you have to pass through more spaces to go everywhere from the corner space than you do from the central space. This is the difference because in what we call integration. The graph on the left shows an integrated space in that the pink space is not many steps from all the other spaces. The space on the right, the one in the corner, is a segregated space because it's much farther away. Now, this difference between integration and segregation is one of the fundamental things about space. You find it's very important in cities, how people move in cities. So if you just get the idea that when I say integration, I mean a space which is well connected to the whole system, and segregated means something that is much less well connected to the whole system. Then you have something there. What we can then do is we can measure these integrations as a simple mathematical value by simply counting how far you are from everyone else, and then we can translate numbers into colours. So what we see here is a colour representation of mathematical ideas. This is the structure of integration in that space, and we would expect that to have something to do with the way in which it functions. How would this apply to something as simple as a house, for example? We take a simple example, a house. What it means is that being a kitchen or a living room or something like that, it's not just a matter of having a space with a certain size and certain furniture and certain equipment in there. It also tends to be a position in the house as a whole. So if you take the sort of different spaces, you see they have different relationships to the whole complex. So you can represent a house, if you like, as a pattern of integration, a pattern of mathematical values. So that in this case, the cell can mean the most important everyday spaces, the reddest one meaning the most integrated one, the bureau is the most segregated one. So you can begin to see there's a mathematical logic, not just to the layout, if you like, but to the concepts of rooms are given different values. So if we begin to study these kind of patterns, we see that where we find consistencies between the pattern of integration and the pattern of labeling the spaces, we see we've given a meaning, a spatial meaning to culturally variable ideas of function. What we do in an integrated space, we do that in a segregated space. So we are bringing together, if you like, the ideas of form and function in a way which we can represent graphically, but also mathematically. Now, another important property about space, especially in studying museums, is that spaces tend to fall into different types. Let me explain what these types are. An A space if I can find it here, is a dead-end space. It means you go into it and you have to come out the same way. A B space is a space that's on the way to a dead-end space. It means you go somewhere, you have to come back through there if you want to get back to the rest of the system. A C space is what we might call a sequence space. It has just one way out and one more way in. A D space is a space with more than one other way back, so it will have to be at least three connected. Again, when we analyze these relationships, these being an A, B, C, or D space, also has a clear relationship to the functions going on. We can apply this, for example, to the Sturm Gallery of 1704. You can see that the gallery has 6 D spaces and 8 C spaces, and you can begin to see that this is sort of fundamental to the way in which the layout is structured. In fact, what you can see is that it gives a kind of a classical picture. Space number 1 is a kind of gathering space, a space from which you leave and a space to which you come back. That's one element we tend to find in museums, and the other is a visitable sequence of some kind. In this case, it's 2 rings of space. This is very, very, very characteristic. So this kind of, if you were to show me a picture of a graph like this and say, well, what's the building did it represent? I would say immediately it represents a gallery, because this idea of deep interconnected rings is almost only to be found in galleries and in museums. So we can begin to give some spatial recognizability, if you like, to the idea of a museum. This is looking at the National Gallery, and so if you look at this, you can see again, you can trace the structure of large interconnected rings. This means that there are 2 extreme possibilities. So on the one hand, you have the single ring of space. This is all C spaces, where everyone has to go on the same route. This is, of course, a very popular way of organizing museums when you want to support a didactic function of some sort. It can be extremely tedious. The worst example I know is the IKEA in North Circular Road. I don't know if you've ever been there. You don't think you're going in a circle, but you are going in a circle. And the idea, it's very skillfully. It takes you to every space so you don't miss anything. You don't go back there. You can only go there once, I think. I've been to museums where I've left halfway through because I can't stand it anymore. So, on the other hand, if we have all D spaces, this forms a grid. This has the opposite problem, if you like. But, it's almost impossible to understand. It's almost impossible to navigate in any kind of way in which you visualize this. So a key aspect of gallery spaces seems to be how they somehow combine these two properties, the properties of C-ness and D-ness, the properties of sequencing, if you like, and the properties of gridness. We don't want to be either one or the other, but somehow the way they're conducted. So space syntax as a set of techniques is about applying configuration analysis, the pattern of relationships between things, to different geometrical representations. It can be rooms, it can be convex spaces, it can be streets, it can even be points in space. So let me show you another technique where we actually analyze space in terms of what it looks like from different points within it. We call it visual integration and analysis. So what we do is we cover the layout with a grid, and then we take the center points in each part of the grid, and we draw an isovist. That means we draw all the space that you can see from that space there. So taking that yellow point there, the grey is all the space you can see from there. If you move the yellow point up to here, the space of this changes. So this is the idea of, this is the fundamental elements of what we experience, of these shapes. We experience shapes like this. We can treat these shapes as elements in our integration analysis. And it tells us not just what we can see from everywhere, but how difficult it is to come and see everything in a whole building. So it's quite a complicated kind of idea. If you apply this to Tate Britain, as it was in a dozen years ago, you see, you identify a sort of a very powerful structure, kind of pattern which is dominated by the central axis, but it also sort of makes linkages to other parts of the layout. What you see on the left are traces of 100 people entering the Tate Britain Gallery and moving around for 10 minutes. It shows that basically everybody takes a different path. Everyone takes a completely different path so you won't find any coincidences. We'll look at this much more closely in a moment. But in spite of the fact that everybody takes an individual path, if you look at the kind of pattern of density of movement on the left, and the pattern of integration, visual integration on the right, there's a clear relationship between the two patterns. In fact, you can test this out because you can say that we've got numbers representing the number of people moving here. We've got numbers representing these colours of visual integration. I'm sorry to have to show you this. This is a scattergram. Each of these pink circles is one of the rooms in Tate Britain. Where it is on the horizontal axis is how visually integrated it is, and where it is on the vertical axis is how much movement it has. And the fact that if there's a complete relationship between the two, the points would just be on a line going from bottom left to top right. As it is, there's something like a 70% correlation. What it means is that about 70% of the movement in Tate Britain can be accounted for by the structure of the building, not by anything else. So the building is actually producing this kind of pattern. People don't intend to do it, but by moving seemingly randomly and all taking different paths, suddenly a pattern emerges. Once we have this, once we have a way of modelling a building which allows us to understand how it's working in a way in which we can test, we've of course got a very powerful design tool. We can then sort of extend the thing and say, well, what happens if we do this? And this is the way in which space syntax is applied. I mean, basically, you make a model of the part of a city you've got or the building you've got, analyze how it works, show the relationship between them, and then you can say, well, no, if we do this, this is what will happen. So this is how space syntax works as a technique. But it leads us to a very fundamental conclusion, and this is a very important idea because it shows that space and social activity relate in two ways. on the one hand, a spatial layout can reflect and embody a spatial pattern. Like in the French house, for example, the idea of a cell commune in everyday space was reinforced by the integration value of the space. The idea of being a grand salle, a space for special occasions, was reflected in its segregation. So we can use, if you like, spatial values to reinforce, if you like, conceptual ideas about function, about what happens in space. So we make culture appear natural, if you like, by building it into the space. So the space plays a role in reproducing a kind of a given cultural pattern. So in that sense, we can say that space is conservative. It's taking a cultural pattern of concepts and behaviors and saying we reinforce this by building them into the house in this kind of way. But as we've all been looking at the Tate, it can also shape a pattern of interaction between people, shape a pattern of co-presence, if you like. We call this the generative function of space. Space isn't just reflecting some pre-existing concepts. It's actually creating something new. This is what space does in cities. Space doesn't just reflect the concepts of individual spaces, because most spaces are called streets, but it does structures them in such a way as to produce and shape patterns of co-presence and movement, which we then exploit by setting up centres and quiet areas and all the things that we value about cities. So let me say, so space can be used conservatively to reproduce a social pattern, or it can be used generatively to create something new, which isn't just something which exists already, which we're trying to reproduce. So how can this be used to study how museums are structured spatially and how this affects how they work? Well, I want to describe to you a study we did quite a few years ago now of Tate Britain. It wasn't even called Tate Britain then. And the question we were asked was, this is the layout of Tate Britain you see on the right, and the question we were asked was very interesting, because what they were proposing to do was to remodel the whole pattern of space. They wanted to add the bottom level entrances, and they wanted later to extend it. And what they were worried about it is that the Tate Britain they'd been doing sort of visitor surveys, and this had shown that people valued certain things about Tate Britain very, very, very strongly. They valued its informal atmosphere, for example. They found it relaxed. They found it friendly. They found it somehow. This seemed very much at odds with the idea that, in fact, it's a highly classical layout. You saw the sort of classical facades. It seems that the question we're trying to understand is, well, how is it that a classical sort of highly geometrical scheme, if you like, can generate a visiting culture, if you like, which seems informal, and which seems visitors seem to value a curator style which seems to encourage exploration rather than using the layout to highlight key works and dictate the pattern of experience. Tate Britain is rather out of the way, and it seemed very important that visitor studies would show that a lot of visiting was impromptu. People decided to go a day or two in advance. This is a very important aspect of visitor behaviour, I think. And the other thing is they tended to repeat visit. They came not just when there was something new on, but they came there periodically. Something we did was a pleasant experience. So it seemed to be both informationally and socially something which was functioning in a very informal and friendly way. What Tate Britain were worried about was that if they redesigned the space, would this change this? Would it continue to be a friendly, informal place? So we were asked to, I suppose, to find out what the visitors meant. Was there something we could pin down, which objectively, which somehow accounted for the informationally and socially informal character of the space? The key question was the structure of the layout. If you look at it, it's neither a sequence nor a grid, but it seems it combines both C and D space in some way. So somehow maybe this good. Now, when we were appointed to do this study, we were warned. They said, don't study movement. Movement is random. You'll be wasting your time. We like that because we're good at finding patterns in randomness. So the first thing we do is, well, what you've already seen. We followed 100 people into the gallery. And this showed clearly that in the first 10 minutes, some spaces are much more occupied than others. There's a very strong bias to the left rather than the right, if you like. large numbers of people went into the claw galleries but didn't get to the pictures. It's very curious. And other spaces have different kinds. So there seem to be differences in the occupation rates. And when we looked at the all-day pattern, the pattern was very, very similar. You can't see it very clearly here, but if you actually compare the numbers, the pattern that was established in the first 10 minutes more or less became the pattern that we've seen every day. Now, I'm afraid I've now turned Tate Gallery from vertical to horizontal, so you'll have to just turn your minds around a little bit and read from right to left rather than from bottom to top. These are the direction splits of 100 people coming in. You can see the arrows sort of show where people went. And there's 11 different places they peel off to. There is, of course, a guide, and people say, the visitors say the guide is very useful, but they don't use it because the guide says you begin by going right down the central axis and you come here. But only 11% of people did this. So you have this puzzling thing of people really finding the guide very, very useful, but not actually using it at all to navigate the place. If we look at this more carefully, we see something else. If you look at these numbers, you can see that as people come in, you can see that people split and go different ways. We're just extending it a little bit beyond where we are. You can see a very interesting function that people are coming down here and going this way, and people are about to encounter people coming this way. People coming around this way are about to encounter people coming that way. Now, this is something we call churning. It means that if you've got enough choice spaces and they're structured in a certain kind of way, people split apart and then they come together again. Now, the way human beings behave is when you're in the gathering space, the space from which you set out in the museum, you scan people. You may not admit you do, you may not think you do, but you do. You look around and see who's doing it. So if 10 minutes or 15 minutes later you see one of these people coming the other way, well, you notice it. If it happens again, it's almost like your old friends. It's curious about the way we react. So this is something I call churning. I think it's very sexy, I think, because people go to museums not just to see images, they go to see people as well. And so this beautifully informal way of bringing people into contact, I think, is fundamental to my work. So this churning is only possible if the proportion of D spaces creates enough choice in the layout. It can't happen in a much more sequential case, as you'll see. Now, to get hold of the ideas of movement more accurately, we then set up a technique of counting the people who cross thresholds in a certain time period into spaces, and then and assessing from this the numbers of people who would use space. We also observe the numbers of people who are observing in space at the same time. So what we've got is a plan where each space has three values. In the center is the total number of people. On the top is the total number of people moving in the space, and at the bottom is the number of people viewing in the space. So every space you've got a viewing, moving correlation. So you can. This is immensely rich to look at this. You can immediately ask which are the most spaces where they have much more viewing than moving, for example. That means there'll be much more. That means they must be attractive. They must be attracting people. What about places that have much more moving than viewing, as the central axis does, in fact? Although this changes as you go along the central axis, by the time you get to the end, it's more or less the beginning of the axis. People are just moving and not looking at all. You can begin to see the pattern in this. But can we understand the pattern of movement? Let me try and explain something to you, because what I show here, and this is using old technology, by the way. This is we didn't have the visual integration analysis at this stage. What the colours represent here, instead of the red representing integrated spaces and the blues representing segregated spaces, what this represents is the actual movement pattern. So what we're interested in is there some analysis we can make which produces the movement pattern? For example, we can ask questions like, what about the size of spaces? Well, this analysis shows there's very little relationship between the size of spaces and the number of people in them. What about the connections to the spaces? Again, that has no relationship at all. None of these obvious things, if you like, seem to have a... So what about the integration of spaces in the complex as a whole? when we do this, we actually begin to find a pattern that begins to look very promising. We actually find if we just join the spaces together, we find a correlation of about 40% for movement. But it doesn't end there. When we represent the layout as a structure of lines, so that they're mirroring, if you like, the street structure, if you like, rather than the space structure, we get a much better result. We can account for something like 55% of the differences. When we put these two things together, when we take the spatial elements of the rooms, if you like, show how they're connected by lines, which is the way you intuitively sort of experience the take one. You're always aware, if you like, not only of the spaces you're in, but how this connects to many other spaces at the same time. You get this amazing result. You get this 70% of the movement is being accounted for by the building. Well, this is very, very interesting because it can only mean one thing. It can only mean that people are using the building itself, the structure space in the building itself, as the guide to how we're going on. So it's not just the churning, it's creating the informality, if you like. This idea that the building itself is doing the work. And of course, this is what cities do. Cities don't have information saying, this is the way to here, this is the way to there. Somehow the structural space tells you where to go. So we can genuinely say in a scientific sense that Tate Britain is working like a city. This is a point that's sometimes made more generally about museums, but I think in this case, we can show it is the case in a very important sense. We can also do some little neat things like correlating moving against the viewing, actually sort of taking all the space and saying, how we plot people. And so all the spaces are down here on the bottom right side of these spaces. These are the central spaces where there's more viewing than moving. These ones up here are the spaces where there's much more viewing than moving. Now, I used to know which these spaces were. I think it's the prereferites, which worries me somehow. But so you can immediately get from this, if you like, a priority. You can say where the attractive images. So how does this happen? I think the reason the gallery works this way is literally because of the way in the structural space work. It has what we call an integration core, is the pattern formed by the most integrated spaces. And here we have what we call a shallow core, meaning that the integrated spaces take you from the entrance of the building deep into the building and organize it, if you like, as a kind of a structure. This makes it highly intelligible, and as you wander about, you can easily retain a picture, or build up a picture, if you like, of the structure of the building as a whole. But it also means if you have a structure where the internal pattern of movement and the pattern of movement from out to in use the same spaces, this is another effect. It's like the churning effect again. It's the idea that you will know buildings which do this and buildings which don't. But the fact that moving in and out of the building correlates with the way in which you move around the building. This is a fundamental way to create a building where people say you always meet somebody there. It's a building that feels social. Again, it's a pure spatial engineering effect here. You can actually engineer, and again, it's made of the relationship between C and D spaces. So this is how Tate Britain works. What about Tate Modern? How does it compare? Because if you take Tate Britain at first sight, it seems to be based on the same principles. In fact, it was based on the same principles. They thought this was the right way to organize it. It's a layout which is made up of repeated and similarly sized rooms with visual and movement connections between them. There's a major axis which traverses the whole length of the gallery. And the layout offers a mixture of sequences and choices, and so C and D spaces. So it seems to be the same kind of thing. But I don't think anybody who'd been there would say, I felt it was the same kind of building. It feels to be something entirely different. So in a sense, can we somehow characterize the differences between this as a visiting culture, if you like, and Tate Britain as a visiting culture? Of course, the differences in how the elements are configured in relation to each other. In Tate Modern, for example, where the entry spaces you go into form a kind of an enfilade, you sort of see through several of them. For the most part, the relationships between spaces are very limited, making You can see the space on the right, so the spaces feel much more like self-contained spaces, with very much less awareness, if you like. The relationship to the next space is much more difficult to see. Whereas in Tate Britain, you always have this sense of being aware of other spaces and spaces you might go to, as well as spaces you're aware of. In Tate Britain, as we've seen, the integration core, this central structure, plays a major role in organising movement between the gallery spaces and between parts of the museum. You return to it, you come back to it, you get to know it, and understand how it relates to the building. In Tate Modern, the main axis is also the focus of the integration core, but it's peripheral to the system and plays no role whatsoever in movement of the gallery spaces, or how they're understood in relation to each other. It's been said that it distributes people rather than bringing them together. And this is very clear. You've only got to go there to realise that the axial structure seems completely peripheral to the way in which it's supposed to work. You can actually show what this actually looks like in reality. This is going back to Tate Britain for a moment. This is the kind of memory you have, the kind of image you would have of Tate Britain. This is the kind of image you would have of again, this is reflecting, if you like, a structure of space. What about the graph of the space? Again, this is very interesting because you can actually see in the graph the mixture of C and D spaces and how the D spaces, if you like, allow you to choose different parts of the grid and relate local to global patterns of movement. So it becomes an environment you can explore and yet not get lost. At first sight, the layout of Tate Modern seems to be much simpler. You've got choice spaces, but the interesting thing is if you actually look at most people come in this way here. People who take the choice space in this way, and many people did in one of 4 cases we're looking at, because it had a very, very powerful image in there of a white Volvo car. People who use this, then either they use it to shortcut the layout, so they lose this connection to it, or else they backtrack down here and try to find the way back again. So either way, it's a very inefficient way in which the layout uses. When they come back to this side, and by the time they get to the choice space here, they don't use it. So you see the proportions change. So you find that the whole layout is, in spite of it's actually working as a kind of a sequence in a very much more powerful way. So the effect is that apart from getting lost and backtracking that I described, the layout works as a sequence. Now, if you have a sequence, it means that people follow pretty well the same route. So there are more or less the same kind of numbers in each space with just random variation. So we lose the sense of a relationship between spatial structure and movement. That's the city property that we found in Tate Britain is gone. There is no route finding at all. There's no sense of looking for the next space because your spaces are so much more closed off. So it's a sense of an unavoidable passage from one self-contained space to the next. Though this does have the effect, of course, of getting most visitors to most spaces. So you can say it's very efficient in that kind of sense. It's a powerful machine, if you like. But also the lack of choice means there's no churning. You can't get the churning effect. And this is reinforced in a sequence. People tend to stay together. I mean, there'll be random variation according to the speed they're going. By and large, the churning effect is lost in this kind of sequence. So you don't get the same kind of social generative experience either. So if you go back to my earlier definition, it's clear that Tate Modern is informationally and socially. I've got it the wrong way around, I'm sorry. Tate Britain is, I should have spotted this on the train on the way out. Tate Britain is informationally and socially a generative system. It's generating different experiences of information from people and generating different social experiences. While Tate Modern is informationally and socially a conservative system, in spite of the fact that it's proposing a sort of a highly adventurous conceptual system for presenting art. What is being taught may be unexpected, but the way it's being taught is highly deterministic and to my mind very conservative. In these two images always cheat, I suppose, but this gives you the sense of what Tate Britain is like. And this is the sense of what Tate Modern is like. Of course, by the way, Tate Britain is nothing like this now. Don't ask me what they're doing. So these results show that by studying visitor behaviour against a background of spatial analysis. The thing is, you must relate these two things together. You must understand the organisation of space. At the same time, you must track people and trace them. And so I think in this way we can build up insights in what I call the visiting culture. I think the visiting culture is an important idea because the visiting culture of Tate Britain and Tate Modern is very important to those the identities of these places, but it's quite different in structure in quite different ways. So I think the design and layout of space is the first step in creating the visiting culture, but the second is also spatial, and that means the arrangement of objects in space. These can have dramatic effects on viewing patterns, and I'm going to show you a few more examples which are due to the work of Kelly Georgi. And it means we have to look at the microstructure of visitor traces. Let me first just show you some simple examples. This is a very typical trace from Pompidou, 5th floor. You can see how it's globally explorative, reflecting the complexity of the layout, but it's pretty linear locally. You can see the way in which the relationships tend to go around the edges of places or across spaces. It tends to form with very little self-intersection, if you like, or compressed kind of changes of direction. In Tate Modern, this is a very, very typical pattern. This is almost the standard pattern. The choice spaces are barely used, and instead you have this continuous linear structure going through space. This is exactly where people have stopped and exactly how they've moved. They're very accurate. I'll take another gallery which doesn't work at all in the way in which it's intended. This is a typical trace of the Sainsbury wing. Again, people treat it very linearly, miss out the central spaces to a great extent, but again, you see the structure is quite linear. So when we look at Castelvecchio and the Carlo Scarpa design of which overall is large scale is simply a sequence, but the way in which objects are arranged in space is very idiosyncratic and reflects, if you like, the Italian school of the 1950s. The way in which, if you like, statues are used, if you like, in relation to space to make them seem part of the gallery, and to make the line appear to be part of the gallery space. Distinctive way of organising pictures and organising statues create spaces which visitors are invited to enter. Sometimes the viewer comes up to the objects from behind, for example, and so let's see what they have to turn around. And this is Carlo Scarpa saying what he intends to do. If you look at the actual traces here, you can see how remarkably these traces have done. They've become much more complex, using the whole space, intersecting themselves very much and literally exploring a two-dimensional structure in the space. We didn't see that in any of the other cases. 1 minute is all I need. So we can see in this case the rate of changes in direction was the number of intersections. You can actually measure the special properties that have arisen. Architecture works by a way in which the objects have been arranged. And finally, let me look at a case from the Acropolis Museum again. This is designed intended as a single sequence. In fact, it doesn't work as a single sequence because there are all sorts of other ways of doing it. But what we find, for example, this is the second main space you get to. Is what I would have to describe as a forest of statues. It's supposed to be to reflect the statues as they were on the slopes of the Acropolis. And it doesn't have any obvious structure. It has a structure to bypass it. And again, looking at the pattern of movement and stopping, you find extraordinary complexities introduced into here. And looking at other cases less so. And if we compare, so here we're looking at this space here, we look at the Roman space, which is the space on the other side, which looks similar, but is less wide and more linearly organised. Behaviour completely changes. You find a much more linear kind of pattern. So what you can, these are just examples that show that the same people are behaving differently, if you like, in the same building. So we say that people aren't ants or grasshoppers. I mean, they seem to be an ant in one place and a grasshopper in the next. People's behaviour changes due to the architecture of the objects in this case. So I think we must always be careful in trying to identify what's going on of this effect of spatial culture, spatial design on the visiting culture of the museum. So I hope I've shown that by observing and mapping movement and viewing against a background of spatial analysis, both the architectural level and the display level, we can build a deeper picture of visitor responses to different kinds of museum environment. It shows also that architecture works. I mean, not always in the way in which you intend, but measurable effects do follow from spatial decisions about installation of spaces and about the organization of objects. So I'm no suggestion this should replace verbal and cognitive inquiries, but I do believe that this kind of observational study and analytic study should be part of the way in which we study visitors.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. That was a great opening. I forgot to explain this, what we thought we would do. We thought we'd take papers together and then have discussion of both after that. So I hope that's okay. We'll bring you back. And I bet people have got lots of questions building up, but hold on to them. Don't let them go. So, we'll come back to some of those. So I'd next like to introduce Laurie Ankine, who is from the Department of Sociology here at York, and also directs the European Centre for Cultural Exploration with me, based in that department, and under whose auspices this event is also being organised. I should mention that. So we're going to, do you want to get your PowerPoint? We're going to move into another spatial dimension now, but also with art museum visitors. So this builds on, Laurie's done lots and lots of work, lots of really interesting papers about art museum visiting, especially in Brussels and in Belgium, or widely, and she has a monograph coming out soon that I know about because I saw the proofs recently, so it'll be out very soon. And
it's in French though.
It's in French, and you could say the press as well. Maybe it'll come up on the side. And also editing at the moment the companion to the sociology of culture, which I think will be a really important volume. So lots of us are very excited looking forward to that. So Laurie is going to take us into spatial configurations of cultural capital in relation to art museums. Over to you.
Thank you, thank you. Well, you're free to buy the book if you want, but it's in French, so I don't think many of you will be able to read it. So I'm going to talk about space, but in a quite different way, because I'm going to try to map where the visitors of modern and contemporary art museums come from in Belgium. So I'll try to basically I'm going to show you pretty maps of my country and to show you where the visitors are located. The reason why I have started to do this is first out of curiosity. I just wanted to know where they come from, but also because I think there are some kind of link between place of residence and the kind of cultural resources people can draw on in their life to build a lifestyle. So I'm really drawing here on Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital. Basically is the idea that people with loads of resources are capable to receive, to consume to a greater extent cultural objects and artifacts. And I do think that there is, as I said, a link between place of residence and especially cities and the kind of cultural resources people can use in their daily life. And as I said, I'm using Bourdieu's framework. Bourdieu is a French sociologist, as I guess many of you would know, or not, whatever. So the thing is concept of cultural capital is, I mean, this is what I have argued somewhere else, but its concept of cultural capital is basically a very modernist concept in the sense that he really has a specific take on the concept. He saw that for him, what I mean by modernist take on is that art was supposed to be an autonomous spheres. Was art is supposed to be sacred in his conception of cultural capital. So those who can be characterized by a like for hybrid-aesthetics would actually embrace this idea that art is sacred, autonomous, and should be seen in a specific way. And what I want to argue here is that this specific take on the concept of cultural capital should probably be updated in the light of postmodernist changes. And especially the idea that now cultural capital and the kind of cultural resources people can draw on, and especially visitors, needs to involve now a spatial dimension. So really, cities provide more than ever resources, aesthetic resources on which people can draw. And so it's really the idea that our vision of space has changed, and really that we have moving on from an urban environment as means to provide sensory challenges and stimuli to create something on a modular level, which would be in line with the modernist framework, to an urban way of life as profoundly aesthetic. And because our relationship to city is changing, it also changed, once again, our relationship to cultural artifacts. So that's basically the theoretical level context that underlies this paper. And long story short, I think the whole idea is it can be summarized by this quote in French. I think it really summarized it very well. Sorry, it's in French, but I use it because, once again, it's a very good summary. So it's from Hardin, who wrote a book about contextual art, and he said, well, we have to understand now that the city should not be illustrated anymore, but should be lived. So really, it's the idea that cities are becoming an aesthetic experience, and that can affect the way we actually consume culture. So that's for the theoretical context. So basically, my research questions were a bit more simple. So I wanted to know, where do art museum visitors come from? What is the distribution of the audience across the Belgian territory? Is there any territorial and symbolic boundaries across the country? Can the socio-demographic characteristics and also the degree of urbanity and of their place of residence be related to the way visitors' cultural capital is composed? Here you can see again the link between where I'm actually heading to, so the link between cultural capital and cities. And cultural capital here is supposed to be identifiable by the set of cultural preferences, tastes, and activities that define people's cultural profile. So what I'm really going to focus on is the cultural profiles of visitors, so how they can be defined by the kind of taste and cultural activities they do in their daily life. And finally, what is the territorial anchoring of art museums? So the sample is I'm lost in my papers. That's fine. It's visitors of 6 main museums of modern and contemporary art in Belgium. So I had quite a few cases, 1,900 people all across the country. The visitors tend to be highly educated. There is no surprise in that. They tend to be a bit older than average, and you have a slight overrepresentation of women. So I'm going to focus here on the population, also on the visitors living in Belgium only. And I'm going to show you the maps, and I've used the communes to develop the maps. The communes are the smallest administrative entities. So basically, where do they come from? So these are the maps. So this is Belgium, believe me. And in gray, the gray zones shows you the density of the different zones in the country, and basically the grayer, the more dense. So you have here more urban areas here in the central and the north part of the country, and here you have more rural area here. I have the impression to be a forecast presenter right now. And you can see the dots. So you have the different dots here. It's going to be rainy. And you have the dots that shows you where you can find the visitors. And again, the redder, the more visitors you can find in these zones. Well, you can see, first, it's quite striking. First, I think you have almost no one in the white areas, meaning that visitors are mainly from areas with high and moderate density. So no one here, almost no one here in the south part of the country. You also have an overrepresentation in some specific large cities, such as Brussels here, Liège here, Ghent, Antwerp, and more rare in other important cities such as Charleroi, Namur, Mons, Brugge, Kortrijk, Asselt. So you have really major cities that tend to attract visitors, and you have other, sometimes smaller, but still quite important cities in the country that tend to attract fewer visitors. So really, the most important thing is really the fact that you can't find many visitors in the rural area. So the next question is, to what extent is this linked to the average level of education of these areas, and also to the average in terms of age in these areas? So first, in terms of education, you can find here a map showing you the proportion of highly educated people aged between 35 and 64 per commune. Unfortunately, I don't have more recent data, so the data are dates from 2001. We don't have more recent data at the moment. But you can see that there is some kind of overlapping. So this is the Brussels area, which tend to be highly educated. Here you have Liège, here you have Antwerp, Ghent. So you have some kind of overlapping. But also you can see that the rural area here, so in the south, tend to be quite educated. So the overlap is not perfect, actually far from being perfect, because you can't simply say, well, the rural area are less educated so that they don't go to museums, which would be kind of a simplistic idea anyway. So there is an overlap to a certain extent. So once again, but I've said that many times before, we can't just explain visiting museums by using demographic criteria. And what is the link between age, really? I'm still a bit puzzled. I'm not quite sure. So this is the mean age per communes, and once again, the darker the zones are, the older the zones are. And you can see that the north of the country tend to be slightly older, and the south of the country and the center tend to be younger. But once again, in this case, I'm not quite sure of the link with this map. So if anyone has an idea. So age, it doesn't have at least doesn't have a systematic effect as one might think. I do think that it has an impact, but probably it differs from one type of visitors to another. And moving on to the idea of type of visitors, now I would like to assess the link between place of residence and cultural capital. And in order to do so, I have differentiated different types of visitors, but not according to their what I call the cultural profile. So not according to their socio-demographic background, but this time I actually used variables such as tastes about music, reading, art knowledge, attendance, art and cultural places, practice of creative activities, and so on and so on. So I had a pretty clear idea of what kind of lifestyle they had outside the museum. And I've come up with 6 different types of visitors. And just wondered where they come from. Where is there any differences in terms of their location within the country? And so I drew the same map, but for each type of visitors. I'm not going to talk about all the types, and especially because you have one type of visitor, which tend to be quite. I mean, the group is not big, so it's quite a small group. So presenting this group in a Belgium map, it might be a bit problematic in terms of being present enough within the country. So I'm not going to talk about that one, but I'm going to talk about most of the others. So this is the first type of visitors, and I've called them, and you probably figure why I call them that way, but I call them classically cultured visitors. And they tend to dislike the most contemporary art forms. They tend to like classical or hybrid cultures, such as classical music. They tend to dislike electro, art rock. They tend to go to opera, classical music, concert, theater. And you can see, well, the principle is the same. You need to identify where you can find the little dots. And you can see that they are overrepresented in Brussels South and Liège. So once again, Brussels is here and Liège is here. But they tend to be quite rare in Wallonia and its cities. So Wallonia is from here, and you can see that in the three main cities of Wallonia, namely Mons, Charleroi, and Namur, they tend to be very rare. So they tend to be located in urban areas, but not in the city center as well. So because they're present in Liège and Brussels, one might actually think that they tend to be attracted or to be related to the most established cultural institution in the country. Now if we move on, I don't think I'm going to talk about this one, but if we move on to this third group, so the cultured progressists, we can see that actually the pattern is quite different here. These cultural progressists tend to be more younger and to have a more diversified and active profile. They prefer less legitimate music, they like pop art, they like conceptual art, they dislike impressionism, they like comic books, art books, and they tend to go to art gallery and contemporary art plays. So they have kind of a taste for visual art and kind of more modern music forms. And as I said, the spatial distribution tend to be quite different. They are present in and around the main cities in Belgium. So they are present, again, I'm going to do the forecasting. They are present in Ghent, Antwerp, Brussels, Mons, Liège, and also in the northeast of the country, so in Asselt. So they tend to be much more spread around, but this time in cities or just nearby. And they tend to be, compared to the first group I've shown you, they tend to be less overrepresented in Liège and Brussels. So what can this map suggest? It can suggest that this young, very active group is attracted by urban culture in general, much more than by specific cities. How much time do I have?
3, 5, something like that.
Okay. Shall I talk about these? No. I'm going to talk about this last group. This last group is the art lovers. They tend, the reason why I call them the art lovers is really based on Bourdieu's book again. It's because they like art in general. You know, they are big fans of art. They like all art currents. They are like contemporary art, but they also like more classical form of art. They tend to buy more artworks, art books, art reproductions. They are regular visitors of cultural institutions. They have a taste for classical literature, jazz, essays, opera, classical music, but also world music and novels. And they tend to dislike electro, rap, hard rock, just to give you a bit an idea of their cultural profiles. And you can see in terms of their spatial distribution, there is this time a much clear link with two big urban areas, two big urban centers, namely Brussels, Liège, so Brussels here, Liège, Ghent, and Antwerp. And they are this time also, compared to the first group I've shown you, they are really attracted to city centers. And the fact that they are attracted, compared to the second group I've shown you, to very specific, I mean, to the main big urban centers in the country, tend to make me think that they are attracted to cities which are kind of mixed between edgy and also conventional culture. And probably the reason is because they are the people who have the most diverse set of cultural resources. Finally, one could say, and one could argue quite legitimately, that in my maps just reflect the location of the different museums I have surveyed. But it might be the case, but I'm not quite sure, because for quite a few museums, and for instance the maps here, so on your right, visitors can not only come from the areas where the museum is located. So Max is located here, but you can see that actually you have people coming from these zones here. There's not only a reflection, the maps I've shown you are not only a reflection of where the museums are located. It might be a bit more true for the MAMAC, which is located in Liège, but still you have people from these areas here coming to this museum. So conclusion, once again, it's very explorative. At the moment, I need to have maps for Brussels, for instance, or Liège, so to go a bit deeper in the analysis. But you can first see a clear link between the degree of urbanity and art museum visiting, modern contemporary art museum visiting. And you can see, you have seen that in the south part of the country you can't barely find a visitor, although this part is actually quite educated. And also you have really a spatial configuration in two steps. First, the amount of cultural capital delimits large zones of geographical preferences. So once again, you have this tension between high and moderate density, areas with high and moderate density versus areas with low density. And then you move on to the next step, and then the composition of cultural capital, so the different cultural profiles I have shown you, can actually play a role and refines these zones of geographical preferences. And we have seen a few criteria. We have seen that the attractiveness of specific cities might play a role. The tension between city center and periphery can also play a role. And finally, the search or the need for a more urban lifestyle in general, whatever the city. So yeah, we've seen that you have an attractive power of specific cities in terms of cultural offer, but you also have, as I said, an attractive power of cities in general, and that's quite important, and that's quite visible in the difference between the first group and the second group I have shown you. Yep. I think that's it for the maps. Thank you.
You need a spatial reconfiguration.
Yeah.
Would you like to come back as well then? I'll get I've organised this spatial bit. I think maybe you should tell us about our organisation of our room. You know, if we should have done this differently for optimal intellectual churning, or whatever it might be that we go in for now. I'll wander around with the non-microphone. So, yeah, have seats. Yeah, so I think coffee will be there at 15:15. So we've got 20 minutes for questions. It is a chance for people to kind of ask questions to individually, or if you've got things that you want to kind of ask across both, feel free.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was great to think with maps and all these colors and all these stuff that I'm a social anthropologist, so I'm not really so used to these kind of very.
I don't do colours.
Yeah. I see the world in colours. No, I had a question for you, Bill. I think it's was a really brilliant way of complementing visitor studies in general. But I also think that one thing that you might say a little bit about was how maybe this is just complicating the whole thing, but how different kinds of spaces also tend to, I think, produce different kinds of movements. Because sometimes it seemed to me that you were suggesting that, you said this gallery works like a city or something like that. But I would think that, for instance, people moving about in a certain city or in an art museum or in a cemetery or in a children's playground, whatever, that these kind of movements would be very, not just tied to spatial layout and material affordances, but also to what people think such a place should afford or should be. You know what I'm saying? This is a place for playing. This is a site for mourning, whatever. So these kinds of people's ideas about what a place is, how does that map onto the actual movement?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, I would say the purpose of space index is to try to express that. I mean, the original idea was to try to develop a way of understanding space which allowed us to compare across cultures. It seemed to be clear that spatial variation was a component of culture. And the idea of space index is to try to find a general representation, an analysis of space, which allowed us to see these cultural differences. So when I'm talking about rooms in a house, for example, of course the cell commune, the everyday space, is a space which is associated with particular decor, with particular habits of coming and going, with particular encounters during the day, particular activity. Other spaces will be associated with other things. What I'm trying to show is that these fundamental differences in what space means to us are also expressed by configuration. So this is, I was trying to make not ignoring that as much as sort of trying to, but configuration may be more fundamental than we realise, because it expresses something about how everyday life is organised and the different things we do in different parts of the house at different times of the day. So you're quite right, and I should have given more emphasis to it.
Jen had lots of questions, but I had a linked question to that. I've got one from Laurie, but I can answer in a minute. But at the end, you kind of made well, you referred to, people aren't just ants or grasshoppers, and referring to that Levasseur work where the ants, grasshoppers, butterflies, and fish. Yeah, so depending how you move through the gallery, whether you have a light on, things sort of swing through. I mean, do you think those could come together? You could put those kinds of analyses together, or do you see that research is not really?
Potentially, yes. I was rather mystical, and I've got many other cases I can show you of people behaving in different ways in different circumstances. What I wanted to say was what they're responding to are the spatial circumstances and the spatial meanings that are created in that space. And you see remarkable differences in which people use movement as an aspect of viewing and experience. And I think the relationship between moving and viewing is fundamental to what happens in that. So these were intended as a provocation, as a question. The way I'm not going to study these things in the very next one.
Fascinating, interesting, and the maps are beautiful. I have a question though about the content of the museum and how you actually fit that into your correlation. So we know in art galleries everybody will go and stand in front of the Kiss, Klimt, if they're in that museum. That's where everybody will go. The Mona Lisa is the most visited image in the gallery. So how do you actually factor that into your analysis of movement?
This is what I was trying to say in my distinction between generative and conservative. for conservative, maybe it's one word. Conservative is where you're trying to use the qualities of space to express some pre-given conceptual organization, like the big 12 summit. This is really, I must say, I went to Google when I was like 10 years old, and all of these things I remember absolutely clearly. Better than anything else. It's very, very long way around. So that's what I'm trying to do. Say, in Tate Britain, there is an order, there is a conceptual order. It's set out in the art. It had virtually nothing to do with the way in which people experience it. So I was trying to find out if they experience something else.
Does this have an impact on the movement? That's what I'm wondering.
It certainly would in the case.
Museums move these key iconic paintings that people think they're going to see. Does that change those?
In the case of the Louvre, you couldn't avoid any of this because more or less organised as one single sequence. So you inevitably came across everything. And it was interesting. I was discussing this with the Tate people, and they were very consciously not wanting to show the Matisse and particularly importance. They didn't want to use the idea using the space to have something accentuate and tell a story, which was in non-fiction. The most extreme case of this is Homburg, where there were no labels, it was just the works of art. I must say, I found it very sympathetic. This classic discussion between how far you're using space aesthetically to create the idea of context from object, and really trying to tell a narrative of some kind. And for me, the narrative tends to be in the conservative, and the narrative in imposing the conceptual order. And so I'm trying to hide my prejudice. I like silence, I like unexpected. I don't want to be taught to me.
Put you in one of Laurie's particular cultural profiles, I don't know. You can classify it as all questions. I think there's a question here then.
Question for each of you, really. Laurie, in terms of Belgium, have you looked at the Flems and the Walloons and whether the Dutch-French influence and their traditional cultural backgrounds has any influence and bearing on it? And in terms of obviously looking at existing buildings and audiences and movement and how they interact, how much is that science of that movement and audience now being used to inform modern design, modern buildings and new builds, as opposed to how an existing building functions?
Yeah. Well, I do have this question quite clearly. For political reasons, I tend to avoid it, especially now. But no, the thing is, I do think that variable must play a role. But if you look at the map decision, the split is really linked to the degree of urban things. It doesn't follow the exact line of the differentiation between the Wallonian and the Flemish. You know, also you have Brussels in between. So if you really look only at the map, so in a way you don't really fully control for the influence of variables. But if you look at the map, the split it doesn't follow the linguistic boundary or frontier. But it does play a role, I think, yeah. Especially because the culture is not. I mean, the cultural policies are quite different in both sides of the country.
Sporadically. Our work has had a very big influence in others. I think it's the concepts of going to change. Some of the terminology certainly comes from space syntax. In terms of museums, the work is much less known. It's much less high profile. But we have a university company, Spin-Up, which provides space and may have been involved in quite a few museums. I hope the new possibly the Drive will reflect some of the input space syntax. We're also consulting on the future development of the natural history. It has been influences inform people read things and try that. But through the company, there's more substantial than it's not on the large scale.
Is that being missed out through universities in terms of people learning architecture and engineering design? Is that a missing element in terms of that skills base?
They keep me away from it. So the postgraduates, I think it's probably right. I think architecture learns to be designed. It's a magic thing. It's in trouble by it's so function. When in reality, of course, they have to take it very seriously. It's a very important aspect of what we do. So we try to catch the major
I catch it.
Right. Well, again, thanks so much. It's very impressive. And Bill, as a neuroscientist, I'm very, very impressed with your work because what you do actually, it's just so close to, it so much takes into account how the human brain works. In the sense, at least in two senses. One is that brain does work as a multi-scale and not a linear machine, and in particular in terms of spatial orientation, which I happen to have done my PhD in neuroscience, and that's exactly how it works. And another one is that the comparing active, explorative, rather than passive, what I call conservative behavior in the museum. I really believe that this is extremely important, and this is, again, I think the first one is closer to what normally brain does, but then again, getting to your work, I think it would be extremely interesting to see how different social groups and age groups and to which extent they prefer more individual explorative way or more guided way. And then again, this leads us to many questions with which I think real museums, and we have to deal, for example, in an art museum, what do we want from a museum? That is, do we want people just to get out of it whatever they can individually, or do we have more guiding ideas, and could be the case in, for example, in historical memory. But, well, so it's plenty of openings, and I think we'll be very happy to go into closer relationship with your lab, because I think there are plenty of things. But I have a very simple technical question too, and that is, you mentioned following people in museums. May I ask you what technology did you use to follow, say 100 people in wherever they are in Taves or Taves Morton? Because from our point of view, this is not a minor challenge. So how did you do that?
Unobtrusively. We tend not to raise ethical questions about this. We believe that it's okay to watch people from a distance, and we're just concerned, we literally follow them. So they don't notice.
Okay.
Yes.
So you had 100 followers for 100 people?
Yeah.
100 students, I mean, following 100 people?
PhD students. Needing the money.
It's an army.
I'm really interested.
It's like the old dock gate system, where the dock workers used to queue up and they'd say, well, it's work for you today, it's not go home. So it's a bit like that.
Right.
But I'm very pleased with what you said about neuroscience, because we have used neuroscience at UCL, and there's been quite a bit of interaction, and people are interested in it. This is a way of trying to muddle things. People appear every now and then trying to use space syntax as a way of capturing principles of techniques. So I do believe the concepts are very close to many, the role of geometry, for example. I believe we can demonstrate the geometric nature from the evidence we have. I wrote a paper on this, called the hidden geometry of deformed grids. cities that appear random, that appear very irregularly. In fact, they have an underlying geometry. It's very, very powerful. More powerful than simple grid, but very much a geometrical idea. I suppose it doesn't surprise me that we build cities in the way in which we think.
But it also shows, your work also shows that simpler and newer is not necessarily better. Okay.
That's true. I think the distinction you said, I think there may be people that prefer one thing or another. I think that would be a very interesting thing to know. I have no idea about that. I think all the evidence suggests that people do have fundamentally different preferences in space. I mean, even house builders are not very clever about it. They provide one spatial culture in one house and another spatial culture in another. It's surprising to me how accurately they do it. So I think that would be well worth researching, but I don't know the answer.
So two people who are already clocked, which I think is probably as many questions as we could take. So maybe we could take the question from Darren and the question from Jeff. If you could both pose them, and then we'll have they might think, they might not, we'll see, and then we'll have the discussion, then we'll break the coffee.
Thank you very much for two very interesting talks. I was taken by the sexy moment of churning, the moment when people see each other and then see each other again. I wondered if within your analysis, kind of daydreaming on how one might extend that analysis to the affordances of sociability, and how do your students ever follow people around to see them looking at others, not just looking at the artifacts within the museum? Because it occurs to me that in relation to audiences and people watching each other as bystanders within audiences, that might link into a kind of broader notion of spaces and mutual gaze, or the affordance of mutual gaze I was thinking about as someone interested in body movement and mutual gaze. So is there some more that you can tell us about the sexiness of churning?
The answer is no. Nobody has done that. What a good idea. Except it might get rather close to being obtrusive. It might be, I mean, a little closer to the unethical. There could be some things. I don't know. There are some very detailed micro-studies of the interaction between visitors and objects. I think they've got John Bonus in Georgia Tech. Very interesting, very accurate studies. But that's still looking at the informational dimension, rather than the social dimension. It's a very interesting thought. How would one do that unobtrusively? Because it means that seeing people stopping is easy to see from a distance. You say how long they stop for. You can do that. Looking at something which would be much harder to see. You need to be closer.
It would perhaps be more participatory then.
Yes.
Because you'd be doing watching of others watching others.
So that might be interfering with what's going on. So I think it's a very interesting idea, but I'm not sure how to do it, but I'd like to see it done.
I think there's a technology we might hear about later that maybe could, but should we wait till later? Because I think it's great, we're getting some kind of things to do here, but let's have Jess.
Yeah, thanks. I find the presentation Bill really, really fascinating and revealing. But one thing that struck me in the particular examples you were giving us was that you were thinking about space very much in relation to the visual, to sight lines, and to physical movement. And I was just wondering, to what extent in the kind of work you do, you're also thinking about sound and auditory effects, because I guess so far as I've worked on museums at all, it's mainly been on kind of history museums, and there are often kind of sound effects going on in one place which people maybe can't see, maybe even can't get to, but can still hear. And then you've also got people, listening to audio guides and things like that. I mean, in work on cities and so on, I guess sound must have quite an important place, and I just wonder how that works with museums.
Yes, I think so. Yes, first of all, nobody has looked at this in relation to museums. I mean, let's say my work on museums is I'm not doing much. I'm focused much more on the city at the moment. You talk about sound, it reminds me of an extraordinary sound gathering in Neuchâtel, And if you do, if you move around, what you hear is different sounds. It's a magic place. It's an extraordinary kind of museum environment I've been in. I'm sure these things have effects, but they're very hard to see. For example, in studies we've done of how people use open spaces, for example, in cities, you would think that the presence of traffic, close to space, would be a reason for not using the space. It doesn't seem to be the case. It seem to sort of somehow obliterate the sound problem. So it's been very hard to find this. Light is another factor, very important. So far, light has not been part of our analysis. I know there are students who are interested in somehow doing it. So these are important questions. We haven't much in the way of results to sort of comment on.
Well, thank you both so much. That was a brilliant start to some very exciting days. So we'll just thank them again, and then we'll change
Sharon didn't get your You missed a delicious meal, didn't you?
I missed a delicious meal last night, yeah. I was sitting in this talk, and it was going on and on. And we straight 5 minutes later, it ended, but there was no end in sight at 8 o'clock. And I knew how to get into town and find it. So I just thought I've had a terrible preaching. And then I didn't think she would. I mean, we all assume that mobile phones are always on. She said to me, there's no other person. And that's the reason you get one, isn't it? When you miss the message. So anyway, did you wait long?
No.
Ah, good.
We had wine.
Oh yeah, that's good.
No worries.
I was afraid you were sitting there really hungry. Thinking,
Oh. I forgot to ask you yesterday. I need to be sure how to pronounce your family name. Dovbek?
I can say that.
No, just tell me.
Okay, so I want to correct both the G's are silent. Say
Okay.
Dao,
Dao.
Bia. Yeah.
Bia. Dobia. 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 Daobia. Actually, it sounds like a Chinese, so I can say Daobia.
I said to my wife's German, and so I said, do you think James?
Yeah. No, I think it's the thing. It's like no, it works. I think it works like I don't know why. No, not why. Yeah. So for example, York would be you can spell it J-O-R. So you don't have the D sound. You have the British J.
Yes. I realised that.
Yes. So like yes. J.
So N-O-O-R-T-J-E. N-O-O-R. I mean, it might not be his English name, but it's just a colleague, and I was teaching on Lucia, N-O-O-R-T-J-E. I was trying to pronounce TJ, but then maybe, please, I'm asking the wrong. I'm assuming the Lucia, and I was okay. Yeah, I think that could well be, and then there's that assumption. Yeah, it's pronounced the same way as Vegas.
I actually think Dutch J sometimes work the same way. Those good questions. I mean, I was thinking. That's also what I was mentioning. Looking at things,
Seeing it, each other, and
So study spatial layouts that were designed for social.
well, I thought you actually asked more like the question I was going to ask, which was, are there particular spaces where it's okay to check everybody out, right? And then I thought to myself, there is the cafeteria where food is pretty, but when you're looking at people, they're never pretty because they're feeding their face. So you don't really want to be looking at people there. You want to be looking at them when they're pontificating, looking forward, right, when they're kind of in their kind of repose. You don't want to see this, right? So I was going to ask, are there particular spaces where it's okay? I mean, I guess the entrance lights, when we're all going, and we're looking around, it's huge. You can character change depending on the spatial affordances. Not just that you can see, but the kind of thing you do in this space.
But I've got tons of ideas when listening to it. Brilliant, yeah. But also, like the guy said, his mapping vision and
Yeah. There you go.
highlight.
Yes.
Complexity.
Yeah, exactly. I know.
But also, ideas. I mean, people arrive through a museum with particular ideas. So even though you have spaces that would be spatially organized,
Yeah.
in the way,
And then people undermine those ideas and they kind of try to counter them and go the wrong way around. We'll touch across the IKEA example. I was so thinking IKEA, and then there's a kind of try and find those cut throughs, to cut out the section.
go to the cafeteria.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, that was a very strong autonosis, 100%. Yeah, it was great, wasn't it? Sorry, it's nothing to do with that. It's the, yeah. Okay. I just hope.
So you will have around 30 minutes.
Okay.
Then I will show you.
Oh yeah,
when
please
you're-
do. Oh, am I next?
No.
Oh.
You're in the next section. It's
Yes,
you
but I
and
don't
Matt.
think
I think
I-
you're next, actually.
Am I? Okay.
I'll have to look. So, this is It's just waking up. There you go. So, the easiest thing is to drag it onto the desktop and then. Yes. And then you can take your stick now, because otherwise you'll have to leave it. Do you want to just check it quickly first?
Yeah.
We can turn that off. And
Yeah,
check
that would be
it on
good.
here. Let's just.
It'll be, you'll love it if the videos work, but if they don't.
Because I'm
My
on
key,
Mac,
right?
I was going to do the thing to tell it it's okay to turn it off. Usually there's something there. And like, eject. Right, yeah, it should be okay to save to
Yeah, we can switch that off. Right. Good. Okay. Now if we
So would I do to
again.
here it?
Have you used this isn't a Mac, this is a PC.
Okay, and then let's see.
Yeah, you can only use
Yeah, but the problem is how these are videos. How do I? Is there any way to play them?
Let me go and get our test.
Yeah, I think
Are you assuming that?
Oh, no, yeah.
What sort of technical assistance?
I just wonder if there was any way to get a video play. Because this is supposed to be a video.
This is an embedded video.
Yeah.
Load it on.
I mean, if I can't, I'll just do it separately.
Do that, but
This is video.
yeah, so we've been doing it on this university.
It's not seeing any kind of link whatsoever. So somehow, was it made on a Mac or on a PC?
Yeah.
On a Mac. It's on the way from Mac to Windows, it appears to have lost its hyperlink. So
if we played it on a Mac, it would be better.
We could try, but
if you did it in, are you using one here?
That's recording, but we can still do it because we can do it like this.
It depends
let me just
because
do some.
Is the problem that this was made on a Mac because mine has been produced on a Mac as well?
no, it's just it just seems to have completely lost the video hyperlink. So if you could either find the video on is it a YouTube video or is it
No.
embedded? No.
It's an embedded one. Have you got your? It would be easiest to do it. It's probably linked via in your laptop. We could link your laptop.
I'm not sure. Let's just try something else.
If it's an embedded video, it's probably a link to the file saved on your laptop.
Yeah, I know, but the problem is I'm not sure I have that file and when it's not at them. I'm not sure. Okay, but can I open the just to see if another video works?
Yeah. You want to go back into?
Yeah, I put it back.
Oh, you want to go back from the stick version or keep? Why would that not be any different?
Yeah, no, it's yes, it's just I have
so
another file.
You want to go,
Oh,
okay, back
just-
into USB. Is it this one?
Yeah. Check my Mac, so if I have
Okay.
anything.
Yeah, that's the problem with embedded videos. You need to
Yeah, no, that really is
it's always best to link them to a proper YouTube.
I've got it connected. I've got two. It's great. What do I do with the other?
Is this alright? Okay.
What sort of file?
I wonder if this will work. Yeah, it kind of works.
Well, I know.
Yeah, this works.
Yeah.
So, what can we do?
Is
this the video that you had embedded?
No,
It's just come out. So
there
you
are
can use it.
different. Right.
Do you have a copy of the video?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, no,
I think it might be easiest just to run it directly from your machine. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be.
I've got got two, but I don't remember.
I have one in my bag.
Very organised, even a couple. So we have another technical hitch.
Sorry?
We have another technical hitch. But it should be
Okay.
okay. Which side is it? I forget. The other side.
Who's
the other side?
That side.
I'm using the Chinese way of, so I can, if you want,
Because they drive on the other side of the road in France. You see.
one for you. Now,
Anyway.
yeah.
It looks so cool.
But your one's on that side as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I
There
went
it is. I thought it wasn't working for a minute.
to the US to be part of this really excellent group.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's put coffee.
We
I
can
was
eat. It's
right.
really easy to put this on
And
this
that's
because
why I was
otherwise I'm not.
screening.
Yeah, I
So my name
I
there.
had the impression that even because the way they gave it to me.
So when I met him the first time, he said, "Actually, we already have names." So they took the first part.
Could you have a presentation on here?
So you will be the
Yeah,
man.
we can just yeah.
I think it's how they give it to you.
Yeah, it's like the way they copy it, unfortunately, the way they copy it.
Did you do some participative survey?
Look,
Yeah. I was part of the
if I had
Confederate
4 minutes, I'll see if they have me any.
But that was different.
If I have any.
On the PC.
Yeah.
When I was in master's degree, I did some research on role-playing game players, and both on table and also some essays and other things like real life.
Yeah.
This guy,
Live role.
yeah, live role-playing, and for like in the castle or in some old buildings, for usually in the summer for 3 or 4 days, we sleep there, and even sleep is a part of the game. You can do some stuff during the night.
You're not that active on Twitter.
Overlap there, yeah.
No, I know. I was letting Roz take it
Yeah,
out.
I
I will. I'll do more after the break.
Because you can only be at one place at one time. And since each time you have 3 days, but it's always different person, even 1 year or another, so it's really difficult to.
Well, I don't think I can do. I was trying to put Madison's on at the same time, but I recognised 2 sticks at once.
You're right. But it gives
Yeah.
Embedded
videos.
I have to wait till that one's out. I thought it might do 2 at once.
Yeah, if you like, you can dig it out.
I mean, now you
No.
yeah, but it's
like,
I don't think so.
reenacting Star Wars.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes no
I mean,
difference.
is that role playing or is it because they actually
But I can take this stick out.
real Star Wars?
I like your weather. Raining. It's always raining. I lived in Brittany and it was always raining.
And so it's easy to rewrite
My experience.
Exactly. Yeah, I
Game of Thrones,
that's
like you have some
actually-
people working.
Yeah.
Only in Spain.
Drag whichever one it is.
As much as in Bali.
Yes, well,
Jack said that it brings less things to do than melting.
maybe somebody already.
Actually, I believe me, because before coming here, I checked the statistic from the weather, and actually yours is like a microclimate. Yeah, but yours, okay, but yours,
So,
it's around the in Manchester. Manchester is very good. But I compare Paris and York, and it's raining as much, like the same, exactly the same, but it's a bit colder here.
I remember being in Brittany and it raining.
We say in Brittany that the weather is nice several times a day. So you can have some rain, but after that, well, nice weather. Maybe 1 hour later, it's changing.
if I no, just
wondering.
grab this
So when you say, I
let's
mean,
say
I agree that the analysis is different. Dated.
Detroit and
How do you go about
Say.
what is the postmodern update?
I didn't think it will.
Or,
Well,
my
then,
question was, in the first place, how did
Let's
you
not
come up with
okay.
that?
Let's put PC Media there.
They like
It's okay, it's really not very important.
I mean, yeah, I think how you could do it is stop, come out, and just play the PC. Is that too difficult?
No, it's not. No, it's not. Well, yeah, but these are not the best anyway, so let's put it.
And how people with the different kinds of
anyway.
So it's very indicative.
Yeah, so they categories emerge.
Exactly. Yeah, I actually did that on purpose because you're having a technique that is quite
working.
trendy at the moment.
So what we'll do
actually takes clear links between the variables and so it's kind of
what I suggest
Yeah.
And then just some point without any.
might be there. It's like it might just be there.
And so these
Okay, but if we start them off, let's see, I think it might just work. Is this the same? This is the new one.
Yeah, that's
the other one.
Let's just put it on the side and let us see if it's part of it. We don't know what it is.
Alright, let's just look. Where did it go?
Actually, we have more talks.
We're just
We have people to degree
But I don't, I'm not sure.
contemporary art is
I don't think it's my I can just click on these.
Yeah, well.
If I remember what you correctly, so there was a clear hierarchy, right? Real art, those with the real competence to read it the right way. So
we have to clarification of what is art and what is hybrid aesthetic. So usually we have something that the formal matter, it has to be disconnected from ordinary life, it has to be kind of sense
Right now, we probably should get there.
Yeah,
it has to be
just a
manipulation
real
of hybrid aesthetics
whatever it
and
has.
analysis. I've done research on talking about
I can do
you can
it.
see actually
This is all there
hybrid
now,
aesthetics
and
is
the
actually
videos are. I look at that.
Is this the worst thing?
political art. People who value
Is that even?
like
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah, well,
if you had
this is kind of,
Yeah, we can do it from that.
and it's kind of a different vision of art should be separate from the life and art should not be art should be seen as different. And so you can see that those who had the most the greatest number of cultural sources who are the more culturally rich, they tend to to different forms of aesthetics than
We're running 10 minutes late.
Okay.
I mean, maybe we won't have time for them anyway.
Probably won't be able to
Yeah.
reach it.
So, okay, let's forget it.
It will.
We can try and do that.
Yeah,
Set
yeah.
it to 12 now, yeah?
Yeah.
Are you based in your
Okay.
all my
Yeah.
And it's doing it slightly oddly on the screen.
Yeah, but this. Oh, okay. Let's do it from
my
here.
own
Do you want to do it from this one?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's do the best way possible. Yeah, it's completely.
It's actually not going to be that much.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's the best.
I don't know.
So it's
It looks very elongated on this
some
screen
years
too,
back.
even more. Yeah.
But my book just came out, so I haven't had the chance to really make this. Yeah.
Like, because what she done is
But this is not in my book, but I've shown.
So we visit the second panel now?
Is there a way to maybe turn down the lights in front?
Yeah, I don't
So I've noticed some of the slides.
oh, it's
Like to go?
So for the second panel, we will discuss the audiencing relating to sites of memory. places that present past events like wars and battlefield. So the two papers are presenting two different approaches to the question to how is the interrelation between visitors and heritage sites or museums. We are welcoming to Europe so two researchers from abroad, Katia Dosho and Mads Daubiao. So I practiced for this one. So Katia will begin with a paper entitled History in Memorial Museum, What Do Visitors Get Out of It? Katia is a neuroscientist. She's a part of a really huge project, international project, lasting for 10 years, it's beginning now. It's an international project gathering researchers from different disciplines such as social sciences, law, but also neuroscience. So, Katia, you have 30 minutes.
Okay. So I would like to start with some kind of quotation from a very famous historian, Tony Judd, who in his one of his last books called Reprisals argued that the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century are marked by two apparently contradictory phenomena. One is that the common representation of history is being kind of lost in the sense that people do not have, as they used to have, one and the same view of past events that had a very that had a hard and important social meaning. And the other one is that there is obviously an increasing number of museums and all kinds of commemorative items. So, so basically there is less collective memory and there is more items trying to bring that collective memory out. And we can understand it in the sense that the way people look at history, people look at this collective memory, is getting more, let's say, individual, in at least that we have no more choice than study how various people, at least various groups, react to what we present to them in museums and memorials. So this, our story starts, as I told my colleagues yesterday, with the 9/11. When we met in New York with what was to be the Ground Zero museum, and talking to them about how they were planning at the time their highly designed, highly studied museum, I just asked them the simple question: do you have any idea of how people would react to what you will be presenting to them? And then they said, of course not. And I asked why, and they said, because we don't know how to do that, because it's impossible. And of course, I said, I think it is possible, at least from neuroscientist point of view, because we use all the time technologies that kind of follow how people react to this and that. And that's how we started. Now, to make a long story short, right now we have this large matrix program project that involves all the main ministries, all the main universities in France, and our main goal is to understand how the articulation between collective and individual memory of major upheavals. We start with World War II and 9/11. What I will be presenting is our first work in the Caen Memorial Museum, which is the largest French museum for the World War II. Okay. So what we want to understand here is how visitors of memorial react to the proposed representation of history, and we focus on the attraction of exposed pictures to visitors, and we stipulated the question depends upon two sets of factors. One is what we call in neuroscience low-level features, that is number, size, color, animation, etc. And then the other is higher cognitive and emotional content of those items, picture, sex, and so on and so forth. We here propose two measures of that attraction. One is the closer measures with mobile eye trackers, which is a technology well known in neuroscience. However, here we use something completely new, that is mobile trackers that can be used in just simple glasses with people walking around the museums, and this presents lots of technological problems compared to what people usually do, that is fix people's heads in front of the screen and see what's going on. And the other one is the new technology for following larger numbers of people that we call in spots, and those are simply cameras that are fixed on the ceiling in different parts of the museums, and they kind of follow what's going on. The only thing is that they're not really, they're not giving real pictures. That is, you cannot, we're not in Orwell's space where you cannot recognize people. You just count them with these plans. Okay. So I'm sorry. We have. I had a little problem here. I would love to show you videos because all this is highly dynamic, but it just doesn't work, and you can see that this is me over there. This is not exactly how I look, but the interesting part is the glasses. Okay, I think I have this right. So this is how it looks. Actually, it looks even better because we have a lighter structure. And here is a subject, well, me in this case, going through the study, the space in the museum. And we are interested in individual expressions on selected groups of people. Whereas with this technology, as I said, we have, here's how it looks. It's about this big, and it's fixed on the ceiling, and it's a camera where we just count people, and we perform more larger statistical studies. And what this is how it looks like. Before that, let me just show you. Right. So here is how, I don't know how familiar you are with that kind of stuff, but it could be, I think it's quite interesting for people to use this kind of novel technology. Basically, you have your glasses, and the glass has two cameras. One is looking at whatever you are looking at, the same camera, and that other one is looking on your eyeball. So then afterwards you just put the two together, and in that way you know how the gaze was moving. Now, well, this is the part that doesn't work, but basically, the red part is the eye tracking of the fovea, right? Same thing, doesn't work. Okay, these are kind of results, and again, so this is a picture of Jews having been taken on the train going to Auschwitz. And the points are actually the gaze points, and that's how a single person has been exploring the picture. It starts, it could be, it doesn't show here, but it could start, for example, here, and then go like this, and then this, and this, and this. Okay. So the point here is that you can see that, and here is another subject. And you see that it's quite different. That is, the same picture has been explored in different ways by different people. There is another person exploring this. Okay, and then there is another way we can represent the results. That is, well, this is another picture, and this is an old Jewish person being in a ghetto on the floor, and it's a highly emotional picture. And actually you can see that the way someone explores this is the redder the spot is, the more the more often the gaze was there. Okay, so basically you can see that it's very close to the face, and then there are different parts of the hands. Their hands, and the different parts of curves actually, which does account for posture and low-level information. Now let me go back to right to this. So that's basically how we get the information, and then from the mobile eye tracker you get a heat map, and here you have the results. Here again you see these are I believe the group results, because we can put them together and see kind of the mean value of the gaze measures. To put it simple, let's consider that what we measure here is the number of fixations. You move your gaze and you fix somewhere when you're interested in something. You fix somewhere, and then we can count the number of fixations within this or that item. So this is calculated, computed item by item. For example, these are all pictures on the same subject on the way Jews were treated by the Germans in the World War II. And you can see, for example, obviously that here there are women walking there, and people look most of all on their heads. And again, you have the same old person, and here you see people. You see that they were also reading the text, the explanation, but mostly the title. Okay. At the same time, we are measuring these larger statistics, and then you see the same panel, that is the same images over there. In here you can see which parts were actually looked at by larger numbers of people. Here we're talking about thousands of people actually, because to give you an idea, there are 300,000 visitors in the Kahn Memorial over the year, 300,000 to 400,000 visitors. So you have thousands of visitors per day, and so we can see what's going on, whatever their social background or whatever it is. Okay, so let me go quicker on. Right. This is a rather interesting image, because you can see these heat maps, and you can see that people were looking here, here, and here, and then also, fortunately, they were reading the text. Now, this is quite unexpected, because people, of course, you can see it's close to the face, but it's also close to what to the text, and the text are in German, and these are results for French students who don't speak German. So this picture happened to attract lots of attention over the two groups that we tested, and of course, as we can discuss why. Of course, we have our hypothesis, and probably with US sociologists it could be interesting. For example, the fact that it represents a German woman with her Jewish companion being exposed for the fact that he is Jewish, and she's not supposed to be with the Jew. And this is an early picture with the Nazi over there. And if we had the time, it would be really interesting, because when we took students, that was one thing, but when we took older people, and especially working with law, their gaze would go rather to the socially important points, such as Nazi swastika and all that. Okay. Okay, this is just not very readable, I think. Oh, it is. Well, I'm sorry, it's okay. This is just to show that we for the eye tracker, we computed the results for very different kinds of items. That is, for pictures, and then we tried to see whether, for example, a large picture is more attractive than a small picture, or vice versa. Whether pictures, this is, for example, a picture of arriving to Auschwitz, and it says that it reads that these people are waiting actually for being burnt, whether they know about it or not. But it's very emotional, but it's small. Here there is an explanation text, and here again pictures and text telling particular cases, which are again informative but very emotional. And here is a 3D object which was very dear to the Kahn memorial director, because what it represents actually it's a bag that was lost. It's a real bag that was left behind by a Jewish child that was taken by the Germans. So it was supposed to be kind of a key object, and it was interesting to see to which extent people would actually look at it. Okay. So here are the first results. So, okay, this is the eye tracking part. What it shows on this part is that the highest, as I said, highest level of regards that it counted in a number of eye fixation. This green part is the picture that I showed you on the couple, which was rather unexpected to us, because again, they're more emotional pictures, they are more informative pictures, but maybe because this was kind of easier to link with for younger people. But the fact is that they did look more at that picture than on other pictures. But the actual value of this whole thing is that we look at the same thing with two different technology, and these are these are item by item, and these are 3 panels, and you can see that within the first day 3 panels are looked at in this way. That is, well, there's the zone, this zone, which is more regarded than other ones, so we can see which one, then you can see closer which pictures were part of that zone. And again, there's this emotionally charged old person picture, and there is another one. We'll probably get to that. Okay, there is another thing here. Again, we come back to this picture I talked to you about, and then there is a completely different subject. This is the way the gypsies were treated. And this is an interesting case because, as you can see, these 2 pictures are very large. They're really very large, but it so happens that people do look a lot at this young woman's profile, and they look very little on this, whereas normally it's supposed to be more informative and even in many ways more emotional. Because what happens here is that this German doctor is measuring the scalp of the old gypsy woman for obvious reasons. So, but actually, no, people do not look much of it on it. And then it shows that they also look at text and a little bit on explanation of this. Right. Okay. Well, this, I think, just gives some technical data and, I would say, advertising for how good we are. So let's skip that, even though I think we are very good. Okay, this is just to show how it works at the end of the day, because the INSPOS, that is to show, it's very important for us to make sure that people are not kind of followed in Orwell's way. So here they are represented like some kind of cucumbers. So we can follow how they move in that way from one panel to another, and you can see actually this is a completely different subject. That's the massacres by the Japanese army in China, and of course one of the many questions that we would ask in this first study was how the novelty of the subject would impact on how people look at it. For example, we would suppose that people would know more about what happened to the Jews in the World War II than what happened in Tonkin in China and whatever Japanese did there. And this was actually true. amazingly people who were in, well, of course we use students like everybody does, so in people who were psychology students or even law students, they had not the slightest idea of what was going on in China during the World War II. So so it was a very, very good example, and so we could see how they reacted to different parts of that. This just gives you a representation of the part of the museum that we looked at, so that if you ever have questions more of particular content, there was the first part about the Jews, then the final solution in Shoah by bullets, then there is camps and gas chambers, and then there are gypsies, and then there is a part on Japanese and Chinese studies. Well, now back to the results. I take here 5 more, most representing in spots camera, and the meaning of this slide is that actually these data are quite robust. That is, we have 2 different days, and you can see that out of this, the attention, because the profile is more or less similar, and in any case, the humiliation and then deportation of Jews is something that requires, I'm almost done, that actually attracts more attention than, for example, Nanking and Chinese-Japanese part, even though, again, we could, it's kind of, it leaves you with a number of questions, because, again, gas chambers are very hard, but in Shoah by bullets, those are emotionally very, very hard. People don't stay very long with that. And surprisingly enough, they stay with more familiar, but not the hardest, emotionally, not the hardest parts. But again, that's just one interpretation, and of course we should take into account all the special organization of that, even though in this case it's rather linear. Okay, so to make this a little bit finer in terms of results, as I said, for eye tracking we use fixation duration and a number of fixations. Mostly we use the number of fixations on this or that item, and you can tell that, again, this picture comes the winner. But there's another measure that is the fixation duration, which means when you look at something, you really stare, and you get kind of frozen. Priest, you say, right? Because it's very emotional. You can the duration of each fixation can be longer because you just don't move your gaze. The differences are very small, but there are differences. So you can tell that in this case, this picture, which is probably the emotionally the highest picture here, which represents I think it's part of German propaganda, and what it shows, it's part of a movie, and then it shows a dead child in the street and people just passing by, laughing and paying no attention to it. So obviously people didn't stay very, it's here, so it didn't stay longer in front of that picture than anything else, but the gaze length was longer, so this suggests that it was actually very more emotional. And again, you would be probably better. You probably better comment on this than me. For example, when we talked about our sociologists, with that they said that the duration of exploration of any picture is linked to the complexity of the social structure in it. This is socially more complex than that. That's what they say. Anyway. Okay, so this is another example. Well, it's not right. So it just shows how, in terms of eye spot and portrait camera, people did indeed stick longer with this part of the child than others. And this again shows that that these results are the robust over different days. And just to remind you that these are, of course, very different people. It's not that the same people come to the same museum. These are very different people, and you do have some robustness. Okay, these are a couple of results that I really like to show you. One is that these are probably the hardest images in all this section. It shows naked women going to where they will be killed 5 minutes afterwards. They are very small images, and they are just in that museum. They're fixed in such a way that children cannot see them. But even with all this, it's kind of you can tell that overall people look not very much at those things. And this is a result is the one that I really like. I would love to show you a video for that, and it shows that actually people read a lot. They actually spend much more time on reading than on looking at photographs and still items. We have different results showing that actually what they do the most, if they have any opportunity to have a video on any moving picture, they would do that. So first is something that moves, and second is text, and then there are photos and things like that. And then in terms of text, we compare here two texts. One on the right is the informative text and just explanation. And this one is a very highly emotional testimony. It's actually a letter written by an Austrian soldier who writes to his own wife and explaining in detail how he participated in eliminating Jewish children. So people do spend more time on that, and most interestingly, actually, whereas this they read in this way linear, whereas in this they actually read like this. They go like this, then they kind of can't believe what they're reading. They go to the signature, they see who did that, they go back, they go a little bit further, they go back again, and that's so there is a completely different way of exploration of those texts. Okay, I don't think I have much time left. This is just to show you how those little pictures shown by bullets were presented, and it shows that people look very, very little of them on them, and they prefer to see this text that I just talked to you about. They do spend a lot of time on that, but very, very little on actual images. Again, this shows that there is some robustness in that. And what's next? Again, overall, the texts you can see are more important than even drawings. Then we compare here. What else? Gas chambers. Again, overall, you can see that it's interesting. You can see that in overall you have that text. It's another text. It's another emotional text where a Jew makes a list of all the people of his family who died, and he's in the camp himself, and he hopes that his lecture will be found one day, and he asks people to pray for them. So again, people look at it more than anything else, and then they look at the drawings, and then less at different photos. Okay, what else? This is another technology. This is how we follow one particular visitor from the cameras, and it says, and it shows the same thing. So he stays here, and then he goes to emotional drawings, and then he goes very quickly through the pictures. This is another example that really surprised us. This is among all the, see, this is a huge picture, and this is more or less the same. It has more or less the same sense. Okay, in both cases, the Germans try to get information on gypsies, and in this picture gets lots of attention, whereas the big one doesn't. Again, we have our right. Yeah, you can see the all this in this other technology. Right. I don't think I have much time. Right. This. Okay. Just this last results for the Nanking and Japanese army massacres. This picture that you can see very over there is quite a. It's a picture showing how the Japanese army soldiers are training on how to kill people with bayonets, and so they just have living prisoners and they train on them, and there are plenty of people, and most of them they're army people, just staying around there and watching. Okay, so this is something that you would think it's quite unbelievable, but again, you can see that this big thing is the text, explanation text, and yeah, this over other pictures, this one does get more attention than, for example, this just showing the victorious Japanese army, but then again, this needs further explanation because you have to compare the comparable things. All right, and then again, the results with this other technology, obviously. People do read the text, and they do look at this part rather than this part. Okay, the results over today is very robust. Again, a different technology showing how people move along this part. Yeah, and this is our. Let's stop it because it says many thanks to myself. Yeah, I just happened to do those experiments, but of course it involved lots of people. I think am I in?
Perfect.
Good.
Now we welcome Mads Daubier. He's come from Aarhus University in Denmark. And he has been working on heritage sites, reenactment of civil wars in the USA. And today we'll talk about the Danish battle that happened some time ago. Yeah. The title of the presentation is Understanding Audiencing. It will be a new concept introduced by Mads. Ethnographic insight from the heritage sectors. You have 30 minutes.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, and I also think that we already have an potential, at least, for an excellent dialogue. Something happened here. Just a second. Just okay. Oh. At least I have tons of ideas and questions and doubts and everything already. So I'm actually going to, and there's also, I should say, some, I think, pretty interesting overlaps between mine and Katja's paper, even though we come from two completely different research environments and traditions. And I'm actually going to read most of this. I hope you can accept that. I just need to sort of go through it. So I will try to argue for a need for understanding wider processes of what I call audiencing, rather than mere audiences. And in doing so, I want to stress the need for attending analytically to the wider situational context and frameworks that surround any given audience and its relations, both social, material, and temporal, to whatever it is witnessing. And I draw on several years of anthropological research devoted to the exploration of heritage sites and museums as complex locales of interaction between what is sometimes called hosts, guests, and places or materiality, including classical ethnographic tools, but also more unusual video methodologies that I'll come back to. So as symbolic localities that explicitly relate to past histories and narratives of identity, heritage sites constitute complex cultural prisms through which we may study the detailed entanglements between human communities, particular places, and points in time. And I will be addressing various visitor practices and perceptions at such sites, and try to attend both to the qualitative challenges connected to this kind of research, and also briefly present a few key findings on what I call audiencing from the historic 1864 battlefield of Dybbøl in the Danish-German borderland. And this is just a PR stunt for my new book monograph that just came out. So I'll just circulate it in case you need to know more about where I come from. So this is the site I'll be talking mostly about today. But first, and before I embark on a more sort of strictly methodological discussion, I want to say a few further words about the very term I have come up with for today, this audiencing term. What do I mean by it, and what does it add, if it adds anything? So first I should say I don't intend it to mean that we should stop focusing on the actual audiences, on the people that are doing the visiting or listening or experiencing and so on. Of course, that's not my intention. What I hope to demonstrate instead is that a narrow focus on, for instance, the visitor, or on the visitor's immediate physical encounter with whatever he or she is facing, may risk impeding our deeper understanding of that same encounter. So as much as I am myself indeed very interested in the concept of experience and the turn in the museum and heritage sector towards experiential and embodied communication, I believe that in order to reach a more nuanced understanding of people's actual experiences and engagements with, for instance, heritage, we need actually to frame our studies of these immediate encounters, moments, situations, performances, and so on in themselves. We need to frame that in a wider contextual and ideally multi-methodological analytical apparatus. So in a moment I will talk to you about one of the ways I gathered data on Danish and German tourism practices in my study of this 1864 battlefield in southern Denmark, which is a key site of the war in which Otto von Bismarck's Prussians crushed the Danish army, honestly, on his way to uniting the German Empire a few years later. The video specs method, as I call it, involved stringing a camera to visitors' foreheads, built into a set of plastic glasses, and I guess you can see the parallels now. Also attached to a microphone, thus leaving me with a series of video and audio recordings of specific tourist gazes, as it were. Even so, I think the detailed recordings don't really add up too much in themselves. They present me with a rich source of ethnographic detail regarding the routes taken, time spent, conversations had, stuff looked at, and so on around this site. But in my view, they only provide a tiny bit of a much more complex picture. So in that book, for instance, I discuss theories of embodiment and perception that go beyond the visual, and also analyze how tourists not only engage other senses in their so-called visual engagements. So we don't ever just see a museum object or landscape, I argue, but also, and importantly, that visitors continuously connect these complex sensing patterns to already existing knowledge, to imaginings, to memories, hopes, fears, and so on. And I quote, just brought a quote from David Crouch, cultural geographer, who said that embodiment presented as only a physical phenomenon is incomplete. It is necessary to relate that physicality to imagination, to social contexts, and to making sense of practice and of space. So a focus on audiencing instead of audiences, I hope, allows for this kind of what we could call relational analysis. Relations in such a broad view would include social relations, as we usually talk about in social anthropology, but also temporal ones. So remembering, for instance, how one is expected to behave in a museum setting, or what a war site ought to invoke in its visitors, as I'll come back to in a minute. But of course also material and spatial relations, as indeed we have already begun to explore today. So what is important in my view is that the persons, things, institutions, or sites are not studied so much in themselves as entities or points, but that it is actually the connections between them, the relations in themselves, that we need to put center stage in our analysis. So just a very quick detour. A few years ago, I was involved in another project with the Danish tourism authorities on bicycle tourism, faced with the task of understanding the tourist and his or her needs, as it was initially phrased by our project partners. There was, at that point in Denmark at least, a certain discourse or rhetoric stressing users and user-centered, or even sometimes user-driven innovation. I don't know if those terms exist here. Anyway, those were in operation in the Danish sort of project funding agency landscape. So while these tourists were perhaps not directly audiences, I hope you can allow me the parallel, because I think what we actually tried to do in that project was very close to the argument I'm trying to put forth today. So very briefly, I headed this small team of researchers or research assistants conducting a series of qualitative studies of bicycle tourism practices that then had to underpin the next step for the project partners' development of new methods, measures, concepts, and so on. And I think our most basic input into that collaboration was exactly to argue for a shifting of perspectives from what you may call users, so this whole user fetish, I would almost say, to use. So like, as I put it here, from studying users to studying use, or from so-called needs to practices. So moving out of people's heads, as I sometimes phrase it, to look at what they do and what they do together. So also from a people-centered view to one working, so to speak, in between people, things, and infrastructure, stressing relations, context, framings, and so on. Anyway, enough of bicycle tourism. On to the oh, here's the Crouch reference. On to this what I call geeky methodology, the so-called video specs, because in this ethnographic fieldwork around the Danish battlefield of Dybbøl, I tried to explore the exhibition, communication, and interpretation practices surrounding this particular decisive 1864 battle, at least seen from a Danish perspective, very sort of defining national moment. A Danish defeat, and two different institutions. One is a very sort of conventional glass case-based, text-heavy museum, and another a more experientially oriented so-called battlefield center. And I tried to compare heritage practices at these two houses, including the issue, the thorny issue, you could say, of national, regional, or transnational identity. And I employed a range of sort of standard ethnographic methods, such as participant observation, what Sharon called, hanging out for hours and hours, both in the galleries, in the landscape, also, around the lunch tables, behind the scenes in the museum, and so on. Also, a lot of standard interviewing, both with German and Danish visitors, as well as with staff and other backstage personnel of the two houses of culture that was sort of center stage in my analysis, and with other heritage stakeholders, if you will, in the area. Anyway, on top of these methods, I experimented with this more unconventional form of data collection, because you may say, so my visitor interviews were conducted on site, I mean my standard interviews, but they still constituted what anthropologists Richard Handler and Eric Gable in a sort of seminal analysis have called completed texts or past responses of museum and center visits. So people were talking post facto, reflecting on what they had just seen or experienced. That is, of course, the nature of interviews. And while I also spent a lot of time sort of hanging out, observing, tracking visitors as good as possible on foot and by doing participant observation, such observations inevitably missed out on much detail concerning the individual visitor's experience. So, as a supplement to these classic ethnographic methods, I decided to employ what I referred to as the video specs method. It was devised by one of my PhD co-supervisors of the time, called Bruno Ingemann, and the method basically involved this set of plastic spectacles with a tiny built-in camera and a microphone. The camera is right here. This is a German kit. Actually, the only kit recording I had, and then it of course didn't work out. So that was a shame. So placed on the heads of individual visitors, these glasses or video specs served to register and tape the actual routes taken, choices made, objects looked at, time spent, and so on, but also conversations between and sort of a view of the interaction between these parties of visitors. So the method, I would say, provides the anthropologist with a series of minute detail absent from standard observation, while in contrast to interviewing, it actually provides a picture of ongoing visitor practice, not retrospective reflection. However, it was quite evident, at least seen from the perspective of my anthropology colleagues, that this unusual method required some careful methodological reflection, because what happens when you put glasses on the heads of visitors in terms of their practice? And also, given its somewhat gimmicky or geeky nature, the method actually became a sort of an issue, both of contestation but also amusement at my pre-fieldwork stage. I won't bother you with that, but I was sort of known as, oh, you're the guy with the funny glasses. Okay, so we know what that's about. So, and quite a few colleagues openly questioned the value of this method, which in their predictions would only provide the field worker with my informant's sort of idealized performances for me, so maybe sort of inspired by this sort of Bourdieuian view of people sort of displaying their cultural capital to the anthropologist, showing how competent they were and so on. That was the critique I was met with, at least. Nevertheless, I went into the field and tested the method, but as a supplement to my more conventional methods. But also rather cautious, I should say, and ready to analyze my video data sort of very reflectively as my informant's sort of conscious attempts to please the field worker and behave appropriately in a museum setting. So what happened, of course, was that the vast majority of those who agreed to wear these specs actually insisted afterwards that it had not affected their visit in any significant sense. So one just said, you got it exactly as it would have been anyway. And that sort of puzzled me as sort of reflexive fieldwork, what to do with this kind of information. One possible strategy would have been to overrule these kind of statements, naive, analyze them as staged performances anyway. In other words, sort of insist that these people were indeed faking it or staging it for the field worker. I think the problem with such a perspective is that it sort of, apart from the distrust contained in it, is these fundamental notions of true and fake practice. So the idea that if only we could get rid of all those annoying, interfering technological media, we might in fact somehow grasp the true meaning of the social situation. That idea, I think, is flawed. Of course, the visitors perform, I would say, but they and I and we always are involved in different performances. So I ended up with 11 of these video specs recording, 7 with Danish visitors, 4 with German visitors, of approximately 40 to 45 minutes duration each. So that was sort of the volume of that kind of material on top of the other stuff I had. And the method also had the distinct advantage that it provided me with detailed data from a group of visitors to which I would say regular interviewing does not really cater too well, namely families with smaller children, because in general I found it hard to obtain standard interviews. I mean, I interrupted people in the actual institutions, asking them to take time out to talk to me, and sometimes people agreed, but many of the families with smaller children were busy, to say the least. And this specs method, on the other hand, were perfect for this segment, as they had to be worn on the move, and it only involved a slight delay when they were sort of wired up by me. Then there's a whole gender issue, because it almost inevitably ended up with the father. Oh, I can wear this. So he was sort of the gadget man, but we could discuss that later. But also, not only were these groups characterized by lots of talk and social interaction, which I think opened up for analysis of these recordings in a quite rich way, but also they seemed to actually quickly neglect the specs. In particular, the kids. I mean, they just ignored them after a while, as there were so many other things actually going on. So all this sums up to the suggestion that I think actually these specs gave me something I couldn't have got by these other standard methods. And it provided me with detailed material concerning the actual ways in which people literally moved around, engaged with, and saw the heritage sites. My video specs recordings, as I said, in a very sort of concrete sense, captured actual tourist gazes on the ground, to use Uri's famous term. But by doing so, they also served, I tried to demonstrate, maybe not today, but in my work, to actually nuance and challenge the sort of visual hegemony that is often implied in the idea of the gaze, by pointing to the sort of multifaceted and often very confusing nature of perception, I should say. So while I'm, of course, not the first to point out that gazing is more than a mere physical activity of the eye, I think, and Uri himself has continuously done so, I should say, I still think that we could say that while it's commonplace to note that perception works in these complex ways, I think that the ways in which perception and experience unfold in multisensory practice are still, I mean, empirically speaking, severely understudied. So one aspiration of my book and my work was to contribute to this sort of empirically grounded critique of the visual, you might say, or the hegemony of the visual. So I want now to move on to a few samples from my material from this Dybbøl Battlefield Center, that is one of the institutions, the sort of experiential center, which includes video specs recordings, and to support some analytical points on the differences between, I think some curious differences between Danish and German visitor patterns at the Battlefield Center, actually, that I think have actually come about as a result of this kind of holistic and multi-methodological ethnographic attention to what I mean today call audiencing, even though this term is just made up for this occasion, but I think it was actually, it captures what I did quite well. So these examples concern the ways in which visitors perceive the site, and especially that different responses to the center's sort of experience-oriented, or in some case playful, as I will come back to, take on war heritage communication. So we could say it concerns the ambivalent status of play, play as a term, both as a powerful communication tool. So we know about, or you guys obviously know about this sort of playful learning communication paradigms, that we sort of take in things better if we sort of, or kids take in things better if they play them in. But also in the eyes of some, as somewhat, I mean, play as also a somewhat inappropriate or risky concept when it comes to the dealing with past wars. So, I quoted David Crouch a minute ago on this necessity of relating, quote, again, physicality to imagination, to social context, and to making sense of practice and space, unquote. And in his analysis of the nature of perception in tourism, in which he draws upon Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Crouch stresses the mental dimension of gazing, or rather of making sense. So, briefly, even though we do, of course, at any given moment see things, places, exhibits, and so on from one particular physical viewpoint, our perception of them is not restricted to this visual perspective. Instead, says Crouch, quote, places and their contents are seen from numerous angles and are apprehended as fractured but recomposed in mental processes. In other words, even though we only see a part, we imagine the whole. So my field material contains numerous examples of such an imaginative capacity asserting itself at the battlefield center. Many visitors would thus negotiate and discuss ongoing interpretations of the war events during their visit. One Danish visitor I want to present a tiny bit of here, a family father in his 40s, is quite exemplary in this regard. So during his touring of the center with his family, kids, he tended to constantly verbalize his ongoing interpretation of the 1864 war events while drawing upon different sources of information, some of which he had obviously been picking up during his visit. So for instance, at the center ground's highest point, which is sort of a panoramic viewpoint, he paused to take in the landscape and pondered over the Danish 1864 positions, while also in the process sharing his sort of ad hoc interpretations with his wife and 2 kids. And these tiny excerpts, I mean, I should have brought the video, but I couldn't sort of really locate files. So this is a poor transcription part of some of this tour. The father standing at that viewpoint saying, oh, of course they, the Prussian attackers, utilized their knowledge of the Danish redoubt, so they knew they had to. That's why they came this way. And he sort of turns around via the sound of Els, and then came down the other way around. And then they suddenly attacked the Danish positions from the other side, from the weak side, perhaps, you see. And it's very confusing, actually. And his daughter plays around with a sweater, listening, but not really following him. But the son, the sort of older brother, listens closely and says, okay, yes. And the father goes on, and when they then surprised them, the Danes, by drawing attention to, with such a heavy bombardment of the town of Sønderborg and of this position, so all attention is turned towards this point, then they can more or less undisturbedly cross the Alsund. That was smart. And the son says, yes. tries to grasp what his dad is up to. And okay, I won't quote more of this, but in a strict historical sense, these kind of deductions are highly conjectural. I mean, this unfolding of this cunning Prussian battle plan is definitely not in line with history books on that matter. I don't want to focus on that. It's not about historical accuracy, this talk, but what strikes me is this extraordinary creativity displayed in these kinds of subjective but also socially organized appropriations of the Dybbøl events. So persistently and enthusiastically in this case, and also assisted by his family, this family father kept sort of conjuring up, expanding upon, transforming these different tales of war and schemes of history that made sense to him at that point. So he couldn't really help spinning stories, seemingly, and he obviously enjoyed this challenge of trying to grasp the sight as he walked along. So what this example highlights, then, I think, is the way in which the center's layout and tangible form invites a certain creativity and curiosity, and not only informs in terms of these kind of multi-sensory and physical, I mean material, spatial affordances, but also when it comes to stimulating the imagination of visitors, in lines with the points I took from Crouch before. So what I'm trying to say is that the center experience is not simply of a bodily and physical kind, but connected to imaginations, memories, scenarios invoked on site. So this Danish family and visitors like it sort of happily embraced these kind of experiential potentials. Not everyone, however, found the center's ways as easy to come to terms with. And I want just to finish with an example from some of the German tourists that I also followed and spoke to, because quite a few of those found the playfulness of a site devoted to war hard to cope with, actually, what they perceived as playfulness. And time allows for just one example from a German group of 4 visitors, 2 couples in their 40s who had been exploring the center on foot. And throughout their circuit, as I also captured in a video specs recording, the party seemed to be sort of generally cheering and actually very sort of playful, even though they were all grown-ups, joking at their own roles as tourists and various activities in the center. I mean, we could phrase this in different ways. Some have suggested, we could say they had a role-distanced activity to many of the sort of childish bullet casting activities, for instance, or maybe having a post-touristic behavior, if we take Pfeiffer's point, that sort of tourism is about, this is quoting Uri on Pfeiffer, tourism is a series of games with multiple texts and no single authentic tourist experience. So these kind of ironic games. That's not my key point. Whatever term we choose to describe this, I want to draw attention to a sort of shift or maybe even clash between this cheerful and playful behavior they were sort of expressing during their walk and a more sort of solemn attitude which was manifest in the interview I then conducted with them afterwards. Because in this talk they all agreed actually that this Dybbøl Center, while it was sort of certainly interesting, they said, but it didn't really succeed, in their view, in transmitting what they called the horror of war. In particular, they, and this was sort of a trait I found with several of the German tourists I followed and talked to, they found this particular installation, if you will, a sort of a playground sandbox with wooden cannons that the kids could sort of play with, build their own 1864 trenches, if you will. They found that to be highly inappropriate, and they gave another series of examples. So, for instance, the clean and cozy look of the soldiers' sleeping hut that's been reconstructed there was problematic. They said, "Okay, I'll hurry." And on the whole, they found the site to have a general feel of an adventure playground, they said, or an Abenteuerspielplatz, as the German term they employed was. And this guy also suggested a range of other European historical war sites that he had visited that he thought had been much more effectively penetrating, was the word he used, the German term eindringlich, so it sort of penetrates into you. Thus, although they themselves had obviously enjoyed their tour of the center, their post-visit critique seemed to sort of be directed at the powerful and playful affordances of the center, which they felt themselves, it seemed, to have been sort of victims of, maybe because of the spatial layouts. We could talk about that, Bill. This is references. So, in conclusion, I want to say that these intricacies of play and proper war heritage communications are not sort of my main concerns today, but you are of course welcome to go to Berghahn's website and get the book if you want to read more about it. What I wanted to exemplify today are these kind of ways in which different methods and modes of inquiry actually often yield quite different kind of data. And this sort of clash I found between the playful post-tourist joking and sort of more sterner reflective stance afterwards does not mean, I think, and this is actually an important point, does not mean that one of the sort of practices or expressions is truer than the other or trumps the other, or that one of the two methodologies is sort of superior. There is, again, no essential need inside these people or unchanging German core, if you will. And these people are not exceptional or unusual. It's actually the norm, I would say, rather than the exception, that visitors behave surprisingly different at different points during their visits, as Sharon has also demonstrated at length. But I think an analytical approach that sticks with users or personas or needs will often have a hard time grappling with these kind of sort of annoyingly self-contradictory behavior. So why can't these people just be, or embody one kind of stance? I think we should accept this. And I have just one 10-line sum up here. So I think we should acknowledge these kind of analytical implications that these shifting practices give us or face us with. Because by adding them up and viewing them in light of each other, I think we might in fact reach a fuller understanding of heritage practices, or audience practices, if you will, and its sort of shifting modalities. So situations like these and the sophisticated understandings of changing contexts of audiencing, in my analysis, could add up to a richer understanding of these convoluted practices of identification, memory, play, and so on that take place at dual and similar sites. So this is my last sentence that I wanted to put up. So I think by attending in detail to different configurations and constellations, not just of people, but of materials, sites, texts, and so on, we may in fact come closer to grasping them, and by them I mean not the people, but actually these bundles of connections and relation better. Thank you.
So we'll invite Katja to come over. So if we have a few minutes, 20 minutes to 30 minutes for a discussion.
Yes, start with an end. This is the book Ken was talking about. For those of you who didn't see it,
Okay.
it's there.
Now I've done my PR work. Should we sit or?
Yeah. So thank you, Matt, for showing us what social anthropology can bring to the discussion and to understanding this audiencing and audiences. But also, your paper presents how a collaboration can be done with so different methodology. So it's great for a discussion, I think. So I open the floor for questions.
I had a question about the outdoor center, because it seems to me that I'm talking from art historical perspective, so I read the report for the art museum, that it might make a difference, particularly dealing with the outdoor space, where people are likely to relate their other experiences to their learning experience, because it's far more directly connected to the discussion. I was wondering whether
I wouldn't be able to sort of give a very substantial response to that. Yeah, you might be right. I haven't thought about that.
but with the two, you're using two houses?
Yeah, I'm trying to see that sort of classical museum space as opposed to this kind of heritage immersion kind of sense.
Thinking about those two different spaces, the more traditional and the more immersive, did you see significant differences in the way people responded and reacted in those spaces?
Yeah, well, what I'm always ending up doing for some reason is I'm sort of setting out these kind of oppositions, maybe in a sort of almost sort of structuralist sense. And so we have start out with the Enlightenment Museum and the Experience Center, so these two modalities. But then, of course, getting into the sort of messy visitor studies material, it turns out that actually the sort of Enlightened Museum actually also affords a certain experiential behavior, even though people cannot really touch and try out and play in the sandbox and so on. They seem to employ other objects or other spatial designs almost for some of the same operations, I think. So in this case, it would be some very sort of romantic oil paintings that many of the visitors would be sort of almost swimming away, sort of drifting away in a sort of almost romantic, immersive. So what I actually end up doing is almost like collapsing these things, but yeah. But there are clear, I would say, differences in, so for instance, in the expectations that people have. So and also the very sort of hushed and very sort of almost like a sort of sacred atmosphere at the museum. People sort of telling their kids to behave, whereas the center was sort of cacophonic and noisy. And so it's very different atmospheres.
Sarah?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting. I was questioning, yeah, I think it's to both of you really, which is what I was thinking about what you can take away from the kind of work you've done to inform other kind of cases. I mean, in a way, you're doing this directly, Katja, because yours is kind of set up in that way, so it might be not a question that you might not want to answer it. But I was thinking about what you showed, and I suppose I was thinking, okay, so people look longest at videos, then at text, then at pictures, and at one level, I suppose I was thinking, well, maybe that's not surprising, because text you kind of have to read, and video, it's going to take time, because it's going along. And so I was thinking, well, maybe you couldn't then take that to museums, say, use loads more video, and so on. So I was just wondering what sort of, I suppose, takeaway things for advising museums you might have, and equally if you did do have some as well.
Okay, actually, I'm very happy with the question, because the real answer to your question is, if that is, what can you do just by taking this technology straight forward? The answer is nothing. So the actual value of all that is the protocol and the way you use this information. I didn't have the time to show it, but actually the real value, and this is technologically very fancy or whatever, it's really hard to put it in place. But the thing is that you have to, the very idea behind it is actually that you study the space, whatever you know about the space. So you model what you think will happen given the different features of what people are looking at. And actually, not only what I'm looking at, but how you think they will be moving and all different kinds of perceptual stuff. But let's begin with just visual and looking here. And then you see this data and say, okay, look, that's what we started doing. That is, okay, look, I have this space, I have these features, these pictures are big and colory, and these things are emotional, and this and that. So all the things that we know from cognitive neurosciences and all kinds of social and other stuff we put into the model. That's on one hand. Then we go with the questionnaires. And for example, as I said, this Cannes museum director was extremely disappointed about the fact that people wouldn't look at his little school bag. But actually, when 2 weeks afterwards, I asked them about what they remembered about it. This was the first thing that came out. So basically, I just as I mentioned, it's you have to. This is a very powerful tool that you should use with neuroscientists and other people by making behavioral protocols and studying those. You cannot just put it there and say, oh, this is the data. This is objective because it's quantitative. It just doesn't work like that. But it is very useful, and you can start using it straight away. Like, for example, we can build up a protocol very quickly in terms of what questions you can have, and really study and really bring the material that would go beyond the conscious and verbal. And of course, the most interesting would be to do both, to compare the conscious and verbal and the eye movements and conscious movement.
Just thinking, I mean, one thing maybe some of your work showed, and it sort of relates to something you said about what you like in museums, Bill, was actually when things are surprising, people can't quite figure them out. Maybe that does something.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Extra,
Because when I say surprising, it's surprising from the first look. But actually, when you study, and we have all the elements to study those things again, the cognitive neuroscientists have spent decades on studying how people and why people react visually to this and that. There is a whole science on that. And then there are people in sociology again do the same thing. So the thing is to bring together and see what is, as I said, for example, of course, first you would think that, okay, why are they looking at this and this is not emotional, this is not, or it's less emotional. But there's a whole set of very rather simple hypotheses about it. It's not just black, whatever. It's because, well, I can list out a number of things straight away. For example, the low level, the contrast, the fact that it's white rather than a white thing rather than black, the fact that it's a text, and the fact that you don't understand this text, you're just still trying to understand it because it's socially complex context, but it's also socially understandable context that anybody can put himself into such a situation, whereas people would not normally put themselves into such a situation whereby they are brought naked to a place where they will be shot down straight away. So all these kind of things. And of course, I didn't even mention that, but of course, with what Bill was saying, obviously the cognitive value and the way you perceive things in an item is very, very highly dependent on the context. So you take one thing, okay, I'll give you a very simple example. You take a photo and you put it amongst other photos just like that. People just won't see it, okay? And you take a small photo, you put it right in the middle of big photos, people would look at that one. And I have data on that too, but it's well known. So actually, all in all, the idea would not be just say, okay, this is a good item, this is a well looked at item, but the idea would be to follow people's trail, the way they go, and conditionally what they saw before, what they do afterwards, and of course conditionally on what those people are, what they have in their memories, what is their social background, and that's what we have started to do. That is, for example, differences between English people and French people. This is one funny thing. For example, right away there was this thing that any semiologist would know, but of course we were kind of surprised. The English read more than French, and the French look at pictures much more than the English, and everybody looks at videos. So, but semiologists know about that because that's how the advertisement is made. In England, people read. In France, people look at pictures. But it works very well in museums. But you'd better know about it.
So why you have such good-looking presidents?
Well, I could say that about what the museum. What was the question again about what they could take away, or what other studies could?
I suppose I was thinking for other someone setting up something else. What is there that they could take to inform that?
Yeah, well.
No sand pits, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, well, depends on. I mean, I think some of the stuff that I maybe not so much in this talk, but some of the clashes that I think are really interesting are the museum staff's or the museum institution's own perspective of what they're doing. So sort of the principles of communication, if you will, and then the messy practices of people who sometimes almost take the opposite messages home than what curators thought they had sort of, oh, we wrote this long text and people sort of didn't get it. I mean, this is very banal point, but these kind of sort of gaps in understanding, and sometimes also again related to already existing expectations about what a museum is or should be. So many people would actually think we should come to the museum to see the truth, or these people should be able to tell us Danish history. Whereas the museum saw themselves as doing something much more sort of constructively, sort of much more sort of complex culturally, but these kind of clashing expectations were.
Can I add something to that? Because I think it could be, given the audience, I'm afraid it'll be very bad, but I'll still say it. The thing is, I think most of the people presented here, you kind of study the world of visitors the way it is, and I think it's great. It's any way we actually start with it. But when we come to real museums, and in particular memorial museums, we have to, I mean, you can't help feeling that it's more than just understanding what's going on. You would really, really like to kind of use those museums in terms of youngsters, and young people that have never left and that never lived and who will never live those things. We do want them to understand those things and kind of see what they personally can get out of it, how they can live it, what they can do about it. And it's not just for our pleasure, it's for their future, and it's really essential, I mean, given what's going on in the world. And with respect to what you said, when I did my experiments, I can just cite a couple in terms of what is supposed to be the right behavior or not. Because it's a free world, I come from Russia. This originally, this is a free world, and we can do whatever we want to, including in the museums. So when I did my experiments, I can quote two examples. One was a little girl, she was not little, she was maybe 15 or 20 years old, running around with a smartphone or whatever, and taking pictures, and then took a picture of a tiny little shoe that was left behind by a Jewish child. And the director who saw that said, why did you take this picture? And she was English. And she said, because it's so cute. And she ran away. And so that was one thing. And an even better story is in this park that we worked in, there was a huge photo representing the hanging scene where two very young partisans are being hung by Germans, and it's huge, and it's basically human size, and it's very, very highly emotional. And then I saw a group of teenagers playing and laughing around it, and then they ended up by doing the following thing. There was this young girl. There was a young girl hung already, just like this hung. So the young girl would come to that and stick herself to that, and like playing like this, and then they were taking pictures. So I just asked them, you know what you're doing? And I then said, well, this could be your mom. And I was like, okay, well. But these things are going on, and what will they think about the way they are supposed to behave? But we definitely want things kind of go in a different way. And so I think that all this work, that's why I think it's for us, it's very important. When I say any people who work on this, if they come and build with us experimental designs and all of that is, first of all, to understand and also kind of do something about it.
Yeah, Darren.
Hi, I've got a kind of geeky question, I suppose. I'm really fascinated by the use of technologies in study. Normally I would video people doing things, but I daydream about eye trackers and attaching videos to people's glasses. But I was wondering about capturing a particular phenomenon that both your talks make me think about, and that was inappropriate looking or glimpsing and glancing, which you could imagine in a memorial scenario. So fixating on an image, I understand why that has a particular analytic resonance, but actually not looking at an image is kind of really interesting in your work, noticing not looking. So I'm wondering if those kind of subtleties, it's also about social interaction. So that's in terms of, did you ever put two cameras on people so that they looked at each other, looking at the thing? Sorry, it's a very similar question to what I asked earlier. It's getting a bit repetitive. So in terms of the technologies, I wonder where the limits are, if you like, whether you're working within limits, and therefore whether you'd advise us to use them, I suppose, is the kind of generic question. How would you develop them? There we go. There's a kind of nice methodological, technical question.
Okay, very simply. Well, of course, we don't work within the existing limits, otherwise we wouldn't be scientists, right? But even within existing limits, there are no limits considering them. This is a very, very good question. There is a huge literature on eye tracking whereby people work just as much on avoiding and reasons to avoid as they work on fixations. And of course, I presented just fixations, but you're absolutely right. It's technically more than possible from the design, the experimental design point of view. It's more than possible, and it's just a question of the natural processing data.
No so the pathways of the tracking,
right,
I noticed didn't go off the screen.
Yeah.
So, but wouldn't they? Is it just that the way that image is created doesn't include the glances away and glances back?
No. Okay. When it comes to cameras, it's just they simply have a visual angle, and it's just.
I meant when it is the hotspots, but also the track around an image. Those early slides of yours. The nodes.
All right. Okay. No, it's exactly where right. Okay. So this you define an area of interest, and within this area of interest, you see where they go, and of course you also see where they don't go, and of course you can do a very simple. For example, talking about, you can do a simple experimental design whereby you focus on some avoidance areas, and you compare different groups, and you see whether or not and to which extent they go there. And actually, you can do even more. Not only you can see whether to which extent, quantitatively, how much time they spend or do not spend there, but what is really interesting is how they go from different areas one to another. That is, they start somewhere, they go, and they go back, or they don't. So actually, just anything in the brain, the really interesting thing is the dynamic, not the statics. Just not just final result, but how they did that. And I'm sure as a sociologist, you would definitely agree with that.
So very briefly, I would say I haven't, to be frank, I haven't really worked very much on this video material that I have had from my original research until actually Sharon asked me to come here today. So I have avoided it myself in a sense, because it was pretty complex to sort of set up logistically. And while I think it did give me, like I said, material that I couldn't have got otherwise, I don't feel I have to be a little self-critical. I haven't really fully exploited this whole, embodied perception kind of analysis that I think actually is somewhere in my recording. So what I've actually mostly taken from it is like, so here's an excerpt from what they are saying and doing, which is which gave me something, but this actual sort of analysis of gazes, and as you said, looking at the bulldozer, talking about the worksmen at the museum, which many people found just as interesting as the exhibits. All these kind of maybe surprising elements. I think I would have to revisit my material. So I don't have a clear suggestion if you should do it. I think it was fun to have, but maybe not to set up in the first place. I have one fun recording of a man. I hope he sort of forgets that he's wearing the specs because he goes to the toilet.
That's where the naked gun scenario, isn't it? Yeah.
I chose not to include it in my book.
Just a little, just something to add up, because, well, at the beginning, I'm a mathematician, so just a little thing on the statistics. The thing is, with the picture, if ever you go into that kind of work on what people don't look at, the very important part is the famous type 2 error. It's the one that, you know, everybody knows that the ancient Romans used Wi-Fi because all the people who dug never found anywhere, right? So it actually happens very often in the science that people say, okay, I didn't see that, so it doesn't exist. I didn't see people looking there, so that means they didn't look there. And actually, it's methodologically improper. So to show that people didn't do something, actually you can do that, but it requires much more.
Sure. Coming back on that, I was actually going for a sociological understanding of inappropriate looking. So we actively do inappropriate looking. You know, we glimpse people or side glance them or whatever. So I take your point that an absence of something doesn't mean it's there. But I think actually, in forms of gaze analysis, there are moments of glimpsing preparatory to fixation. For example, you know, it's kind of visual pointing. And the deixis that I imagine happened in your videos with that occurs with glimpsing too. So I was kind of after that kind of phenomenon.
It's
so might,
trickier, but you can do that.
So you could imagine people glancing off the screen.
Oh, absolutely, that's what they do.
Looking at the other people that are coming around the other, churning around the other way for a moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you have some more questions, we can talk during lunch.
Yeah. Well, if you want.
Do we move?
So